Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto has ancient chakra bloodline. Before I start, please support for more amazing content and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by SHADOW12 and link in description and support writer. Let's start the video. Chapter 1. The Awakened Blood. Is this the first time you've seen a comrade die? A figure asked with a feminine voice as she gazed down at a blonde-haired boy holding the body of his comrade. Naruto Uzumaki stared down at the senbon-riddled body of Sasuke Uchiha. The enemy's words or the fact that he was covered in the needles as well, not even registering to him. Why? Why would he sacrifice himself for me? That thought was the only thing on his mind at the moment. He just could not understand why Sasuke Uchiha, the golden boy of Konoha, would sacrifice himself for someone like him, the village's demon. All his life Naruto had been hated in the leaf, ostracized by the village of his birth, by the very people he had sworn to protect, and all because of something that was out of his control, and something he had no choice in. You see, Naruto was what was known as a Jinchuriki, or a human container for a beast of untold power. In this particular case, Naruto held the Kyuubi, or the nine-tailed demon fox. The fourth Hokage, the leader of the village at the time and rumored to be the strongest shinobi in the elemental nations, had been unable to defeat the beast on his own when it attacked the village and had done the next best thing. He sealed it into a newborn Naruto at the cost of his own life. It was because of this that Naruto was so hated in the Leaf Village. Parents never let their children be around him, his schooling at the ninja academy had constantly been sabotaged by biased instructors, and he'd been forced to live off the barest necessities because the shopkeepers kept overcharging him for even the smallest amount and most rotten of food. It was only recently that Naruto had graduated and things had started looking up for him, and he'd even managed to make a few friends. One of whom had just jumped in front of the senbon needles meant for him. Why? Suddenly, Naruto's vision blurred and he felt an extreme amount of pain assault his eyes. It was as if someone had ripped them out and poured liquid magma inside their sockets before replacing them and sewing them shut. He didn't even have time to fully register it or give any sign of even feeling it before his vision went completely black. Face it, Naruto, the hunter nin stated, unaware of what was happening to Naruto at the moment. This is the life of a shinobi. Death is a part of our everyday life. We all have the shadow of death hanging over us in this life. Your friend managed to land a blow to me without flinching and still chose to die protecting you. He is a shinobi to be respected. Haku stared sadly beneath her mask at the still form of the blonde. She knew from the way Naruto's form was beginning to shake that her earlier assumption was true. This was the first time Naruto had saw a comrade fall in combat, but any remorse she felt for causing the blonde any harm was cut off when an oppressive feeling filled the air and a strange red chakra tinted with black began to come from the genin, slowly pushing the senbon covering Naruto's body out and healing the puncture wounds. And with that strange chakra came an immense and uncontrollable feeling. The feeling which had Haku struggling to draw breath as she fought off the urge to run, to get away from the person unleashing it. The feeling was that of pure, primal and unadulterated bloodlust. It only got worse when Naruto brought his head up and stared at her with empty eyes. Haku shivered, those eyes held nothing, not a hint of emotion. It was as if the person inside had checked out and his body was moving on its own. Such chakra. She thought in amazement despite the bloodlust in the air. Normal chakra cannot be seen, but yet this it's so dense I can see it clear as day. Haku could only watch as Naruto set Sasuke's body down and crouched low on all fours. They stared at each other for a moment, her chocolate brown eyes stared into the suddenly changing azure blue. Haku watched in fear and slight awe as the blonde's eyes slowly morphed from their azure to a burning honey yellow. By the time they finished his eyes were completely yellow, not even the whites remained. Only the vertically slighted pupil contrasted with the yellow of his eyes. Haku stared for several moments, transfixed with the sight. Is that a taijutsu? She thought to herself in wonder. She was jerked out of her thoughts when Naruto suddenly blurred out of sight. It was only on instinct that Haku reacted and just barely managed to jump out of her ice mirror and into another before a chakra-covered fist smashed right through it. Naruto blurred out of sight again, and a split second later Haku was jumping in and out of her mirrors as Naruto smashed through them one by one. As they continued this, Haku had no idea how right her earlier thought was and just where Naruto was. Mindscape, he didn't know what happened or how it happened. One moment Naruto was staring at the lifeless body of his teammate and the next he's in a sewer of some kind, with ankle-deep water, dim lighting and two different sized pipes. One pipe, a rather large one at that, was a dark red in color and seemed to be tinted black on the edges. The other, this one looking normal in size and glowing a bright blue, felt as if he was connected to it somehow. Both pipes seemed to be coming and going from numerous directions. But the red one looked to be coming mainly from the end of the hall Naruto was in, which had a bright red light illuminating the corridor. Naruto's head cocked to the side in curiosity at his sudden change in location. It was only a moment or so after his arrival when he became aware of something. The air around him, it was moving toward the light before coming back at him. It was as if there was something big down there breathing the air in and out. However, before the blonde could ponder any further at his location, a voice, loud and reverberating off the walls of the sewer-like area, spoke. "Come to the light, young one, there is much we must discuss." Despite all the warnings going off in his head, Naruto did as the voice said and made his way down the corridor to the red light. When he got to the end and rounded the corner, he suddenly found himself in a cavernous room that stretched further than his eyes could see and had a ceiling that couldn't even be seen. However, on the wall he was facing there was a door to a cage. A cage so large that it stretched the inner width of the room and was just as high. It also had a paper with the kanji for seal written on it stuck to the place the lock would be, not that Naruto noticed that. As he stared at the cage, Naruto heard a roaring wind from within and the air around him moving faster than it was when he had first appeared in this place. Gulping, he took 2 slow steps towards the cage until he jumped back when 2 eyes with golden eyes and slitted pupils suddenly appeared from the darkness inside. "Finally you show up, though I knew it would only be a matter of time since you have accessed my chakra." A monstrous voice chuckled not a moment after the eyes appeared. The sound of it sent shivers down Naruto's spine. Naruto gulped again and looked ready to turn tail and run, but if Naruto was one thing then he was stubborn and would not run from anything, no matter how terrifying it was. And so he took a shuddering breath and looked straight into the gold eyes. "Who are you?" he asked, with a voice that betrayed no emotion. He could almost feel the owner of the eyes' quirked brow before there was a low chuckling. "I would expect you to recognize the being sealed within you. But then again, considering the rather interesting changes I have gone through since being sealed within you, the fact that you do not is to be expected." After the voice said this there was a movement inside the cage and then 2 torches on either side of the room came to life and the area was suddenly bathed in light. It was as the inside of the cage was illuminated that Naruto saw just what was inside the cage and the sight almost made him faint from shock. Towering above him was a 700-foot-high dragon, its wings folded against its back but poised at the ready in case it needed to take flight. Its scales were a pitch black in color and glinted in the wavering light menacingly. Atop its head were 2 long and jagged horns that stretched up good 8 feet further. At the base of its hand and feet were 5 long and rather sharp-looking claws, though the thing that got Naruto's attention the most was what was slowly swaying behind the dragon, 9 scaly and pitch black tails, each topped with a bony spike. Naruto's eyes flew wide open upon catching the sight and his mouth dropped open in shock. The dragon seemed to gain a small smirk, though the sight of the many teeth in its mouth did nothing to help Naruto's situation, and it chuckled. "So, have you figured it out yet, or do you need another hint?" it asked. Hearing the deep voice seemed to snap Naruto out of his state because his hand suddenly flew up to point at the dragon. "Why, you're the Kyuubi," he shouted, though his head cocked to the side after a moment, "but I thought you were supposed to be a fox." The dragon sighed in exasperation and its paw came up to palm its face, or snout, whichever you prefer. "Baka," it muttered before straightening itself on its hunches and fixing Naruto with a stern gaze. "Yes, well, as you have oh so correctly guessed, I am the Kyuubi no Kitsune." It paused a moment as a thoughtful look appeared on its face. "Scratch that," it said, once again fixing Naruto with its gaze. "I used to be the Kyuubi no Kitsune. I have been going through changes since the day I was sealed within you, human." It was only a moment ago that they finished. Coincidentally, this also happened to be the moment your bloodline awaked. "Bloodline?" Naruto asked as his head cocked to the side in wonder. It was only a moment later that a bright smile took root on his face and he let out a whoop of joy and pumped his fist into the air. "Ha! I have a bloodline. Take that, Sasuke team. You aren't the only one who's special." His celebrating was suddenly put to a stop when a large white claw was violently thrust through the bars of the cage, only to stop just short of ripping through his face. "That's enough," Kyuubi exclaimed angrily. "No longer will you wear that infernal mask of false stupidity and joy. If you are to continue being my container and wish to receive my help, then stop hiding behind it. Show your real self and do not care what those blasted villagers think of you any longer. I am sick and tired of watching as you hide your true self and abilities behind that thing." The Kyuubi stopped and took a breath to calm itself and glared at Naruto, who now had his head bowed low. The dragon raised a scaly eyebrow in interest at the blonde's reaction. "Hatchling?" it asked slowly as if testing the waters. Slowly, ever so slowly, Naruto's shoulders began to shake and he let out a raspy chuckle and then another and another after that. Soon they were coming out right after the other and it increased until it was full, blown-out laughter. After several moments, Naruto managed to calm himself and looked up at the kitsune-turned-dragon, his eyes no longer sparkling and full of life, now they were dull and lifeless. Though looking closer, Kyuubi saw the spark of life was still there, just now more of a little flame compared to the inferno they usually radiated. "Sorry about that," Naruto said as the occasional odd chuckle still escaped him. His voice now sounded duller as well. "But I was beginning to wonder when someone other than the old man would realize that my mask was what they were seeing. The dragon smirked, revealing its sharp and pointy fangs. They might not have yet, but do not forget, hatchling. Being sealed inside you has allowed me to witness your life along with you. There is nothing you have done that I don't know about. Such as? Naruto asked, quirking his eyebrow at the caged dragon with a smirk. Ayubi recoiled a bit. Naruto was blatantly daring it to reveal something that only the blonde would know about his life. The dragon smirked back, it was starting to like this kid and decided to play ball a bit. Such as you are secretly training with the Hyuga and Uchiha heiresses. That and you just so happen to know about the Hyuga's feelings for you and you. Okay. I get it. You know everything I've done in my life, just don't say any more. Naruto shouted up at the dragon, an embarrassed blush on his face as he looked away. He had not expected the Kyuubi to know those particular facts. The fox-turned dragon let out a deep rumbling chuckle once it saw the red hue on Naruto's face. While Naruto hid most of his emotions from the village, even he could not deny that he had always had a soft spot he had for the young heiresses. The dragon didn't know why exactly, but it figured it had something to do with how the girls were treated by their families, though the Uchihas had all been wiped out by Itachi, save for 3 members, Sasuke, Satsuki and Mikoto. 1. As much as I'd like to sit here and embarrass you, hatchling, I would like to get to why you are here. The dragon announced, getting back to business. Naruto's blush immediately vanished and he turned his full attention back to the Kyuubi. I'm listening. Very well then, the dragon said before clearing a throat importantly. As you know, I am the Kyuubi no Kitsune, however that title is no longer suitable, so call me Yami no Tsudzurarik, 9-tailed dragon of darkness. Naruto nodded, mentally cataloging the new name and saving it to memory. The changes I have go through relate to the reason why you are here, so we'll move that. The newly named Tsudzura said, settling down on its stomach and resting its head on its hands. You, he brought a spiked tail up and pointed at Naruto. Have unlocked the bloodline of your clan, hold your tongue. The dragon glared at the blonde as he opened his mouth, a question already ready to be asked. Naruto shrank back, closing his mouth and nodded slightly. Very good, now, as I said you have unlocked your clan's bloodline. A bloodline, I might add, that is as old as the ninja lands themselves. It continued, I won't explain it fully yet, as we don't have the time to cover it in its entirety. However, I will give you a very basic assessment of its abilities. Naruto nodded, listening with rapt attention. The dragon nodded, this was the Naruto it could work with. First and foremost, this is no ordinary bloodline as it is the eldest of them all, and thus predates them, and also is the only one known to cross the boundaries other bloodlines are prohibited by. Do you know what those boundaries are, hatchling? The dragon asked of its container. Naruto nodded, those would be the 3 very aspects of a bloodline itself. Basically the different types of bloodline can be, those being the eyes, body and chakra. Neither is better than the others as they all hold unique advantages and disadvantages over the others, and a person may only hold one type, as any more than that, and it would be impossible for either to activate, or, if they both did the body would tear itself apart from the bloodlines fighting for dominance. Right. The dragon nodded as its smirk widened. It expected nothing less from its host's real personality. That's right, the dragon nodded before continuing. Now, as I was saying. Your bloodline crosses the boundaries that others cannot, as it affects all 3 aspects. The dragon chuckled at Naruto's shocked expression. However, it unlocks in 3 separate stages. The dragon remarked, much to Naruto's continued surprise. The first would be the eye aspect, or as it more referred as these days, a Dijutsu. The strength and enhancements upon achieving them varies from holder to holder, but they are very much the same, enhanced vision, where your eyesight improves to a point comparable and maybe beyond that of an eagle's. You'd be able to spy on an enemy from up to 8 meters from their position and be able to discern even the slightest of changes in your surroundings. The next and final enhancement is thermal vision. This also doubles as something similar to the Byakugan of the Hyuga clan as it allows you to see the heat and/or their chakra, though it is only from one direction instead of their 359 degrees of sight. Also this puts your body in peak physical condition, hatchling, but it will not maintain it for you. So you best not get lazy in your training. The dragon finished its rather lengthy explanation. Naruto was about to speak when the dragon's head jerked up and it looked straight at the high ceiling. Naruto barely had time to quirk an eyebrow before it cursed and turned its attention back to him. I'm sorry, hatchling, but we must leave the rest of the explanation for later. I sense your friends outside are in danger and there is little time to act. However, I also sense there is a seal of some kind trying to stop your bloodline from activating and is what caused you that pain you felt just before arriving here, so I'll just take care of that before sending back outside to help your friends. Tsudzura said hastily. What? Why would there be a seal on my other than yours? Naruto finally spoke, unable to hold back his questions at this revelation, though his voice may have been void of its usual exuberance, his shout was almost rivaling its old volume. The dragon shook its head, I am uncertain, young one, but even if I were, I have no time to explain how it got there. Just know that it is trying to block your bloodline from activating and needs to be gotten rid of. If it is not, it could mean an excruciating death. Naruto's eyes widened and he gulped a little. An excruciatingly painful death did not sound pleasant. Very well, he said, looking the dragon in the eye once more. How do we get rid of it? Sudzrao stared at him for a moment, as if contemplating how to remove the extra seal. Before speaking, simply touch my claw hatchling. Doing so will allow me to channel enough chakra through you to break the seal and fully unlock the first stage of the draconic blood. The Raigin too. As it said this, the fox-turned dragon poked one of its claws through the bars of its prison. Naruto nodded and mentally stored the name to his bloodline as he walked up to the cage and placed his palm on the curved claw. Almost immediately upon his hand touching the smooth surface, a red and black chakra shot out of it and surrounded him before an untold amount of pain began flowing through his body. Biting his tongue to hold off a scream, Naruto looked up at the caged dragon to see its golden eyes holding a great deal of remorse. Sorry for this, hatchling, but the pain is a drawback to the breaking of the seal holding your bloodline. Sudzrao muttered, sounding truly regretful. That was the last thing that Naruto heard before he found himself outside, his hands on his head and crouched low to the ground. Only something was different. His sight was better than it ever had been before, and his body felt different, stronger, taller, more developed even. Almost like it had suddenly grown several inches and all the malnourishment of his body had been reversed. Despite this, Naruto remembered why he was there and why his vision was better than ever before. Looking up, he saw a pair of fearful brown eyes staring into his own and an extremely familiar pale face. Haku. Outside, a few moments earlier, Haku gasped in pain as the out-of-control Naruto broke through the last of her mirrors and landed a solid punch on her masked face. Said mask was shattered on impact and she was sent flying back. Ah! She gasped again as she impacted the bridge and skid to a halt on the rough cement. She had little time to regain her bearings as Naruto was on her again, his fist raised and ready strike and a bloodthirsty look in his eyes. Seeing it coming and having no way to block or dodge it, Haku could only watch as came in for the finishing blow. She watched almost in slow motion as it came closer and closer, only to suddenly stop just before it hit her. She was surprised that Naruto hadn't finished his attack and ended the battle, but that surprise quickly vanished when Naruto's fist suddenly shot back to his person and grasped his head as the black and red chakra vanished and Naruto started screaming in agony. Haku, although surprised about the sudden change in Naruto, scrambled to her feet and backed away from the screaming blonde, never once taking her eyes off him. One thing was clear to the ice user though, whatever was happening to him was going to be big. Never in her life had her thoughts been so right, because as soon as they made their way across Haku's mind, Naruto's scream became all the worse as his body began to seemingly grow. His arms and legs lengthened, his muscles stretched and bulged as they became more defined. Now too big for his orange jumpsuit to hold as it strained against the new muscles beneath it. Though those weren't the only changes Naruto's body seemed to be going through. His hair was lengthening as well and becoming darker in color with red streaks running through his locks. His whisker marks lightened and almost disappeared completely, though they were still there, just so light one had to actually look to see them. Haku stood stock still as she watched all this and more happen to the genin in front of her, but as the changes appeared to be slowing down, she was forced to brace herself as a shockwave of power blasted off of Naruto's body. So great was the shock wave that it caused a crater to form in the cement beneath them and shredded his training jumpsuit, leaving the now red-streaked blonde in nothing but a tight black chainmail shirt and little more than tattered threads for pants. 3. All through the changes his body underwent, Naruto had not ceased his screaming, but the changes appeared to have stopped after the shock wave, and with them Naruto's pain-filled screams. Haku stood there and waited, she was unsure about what the blonde would do now after all she had witnessed. For all she knew, he could continue his previous assault on her, and with those new muscles of his, she was sure she would be unable to survive another battering like that. So she waited for the blonde to make the first move. She didn't have to wait long as the blonde's panting form looked up to her, and Haku let out another gasp, this one of surprise, as she got another look at the blonde's eyes. They were the same as when he used that strange chakra, but no longer as light as they had been. Instead, both the sclera and her eyes had changed to a dark golden color, with her eyes still visible as they were a slightly darker shade, and each held a blood-red slitted pupil in its center. Haku was brought out of her reverie when she heard Naruto speak, his voice now sounding much deeper than the childish pitch it once was, and just as powerful. Haku. Normal time. Naruto stared at the pale face of the girl he had met in the forest a few days beforehand. Even if he had hidden just how knowledgeable he was, he had not expected Haku of all people to be the fake hunter nin he'd been fighting. You're the fake hunter nin? He asked, though was surprised when he heard how deep his voice now was. Although still shocked from the recent events, Haku was aware enough to respond, why do you not strike? Naruto arched a brow, Did you not just have my life in your hands? Haku asked, why did you not finish it? I'm useless to Zabuza-sama now that I've lost. What do you mean? Naruto asked, genuinely confused as to what the girl was talking about. Haku then went on to tell him about her life as a child. How she grew up on a small farm outside of Kiri and how when she was only 7 had found that she could control the water around her and turn it to ice. How she had been scolded by her mother for using it once she showed it to her and how her father had witnessed the event and formed a mob to kill the monsters that were his family. And how Haku had witnessed her own father cut down her mother in front of her and then turn the blade onto her, only for her bloodline to react to the threat by lashing out at it, killing her father and the mob as a result. After that Haku explained how she'd been living on the streets for several months afterwards before Zabuza had come across her and saw what she could do before taking her in and had been training her to be a weapon ever since. "Do you see now, Naruto?" Haku asked after finishing her story, her eyes and voice almost lifeless. "I am useless to Zabuza-sama now. I swore to serve him until I no longer could, I have failed him. So please kill me." She muttered in a voice so low Naruto probably wouldn't have heard her if it hadn't been for his sensitive hearing. Naruto recoiled a bit at her request, though he could understand where she was coming from. Even if he was hated inside the village of his birth, Naruto would still do anything to protect it. That was the only real thing about his mask of idiocy, the strength loyalty to the village. Not just because it was his home, but even amongst the hostility in the Leaf, he had precious people, friends he'd be willing to sacrifice everything for. Naruto could honestly admit to himself that he wouldn't know what to do with himself if he lost even one of them, though looking at the girl in front of him, he figured he'd ask the same if he lost them all. It was with a heavy sigh that Naruto took out a kunai from the hip pouch that was somehow still hanging from what was left of his belt and held it up, its tip pointing at Haku. But there was something holding him back from doing what she asked of him. The images of 2 girls flashed in front of his mind's eye. One with long dark raven hair and eyes as black as the night and another with dark shoulder-length blue hair and pale lavender eyes. The images seemed to dance in front of Haku before settling down on either side of her, serious looks on their faces as they shook their heads in the negative. "Hina-chan, Suki-chan." He thought as his eyes widened at the images of the young heiress. Just seeing them standing beside Haku was enough to seal his decision and he quickly stowed the knife back into his pouch. The images of Hinata and Satsuki smiled and nodded before vanishing. Haku, well oblivious to what Naruto had seen, had witnessed him take out his kunai before putting it away again. She knew his answer to her request. "Why? Why won't you do as I ask?" she asked sadly, staring at him as tears ran down her face. Naruto sighed, but before he could say anything they both heard something that sounded like 1,000 birds chirping, as well as a large chakra spike coming from somewhere in the surrounding mist. Haku, sensing her master was in trouble, thought she could do one last service for him and rapidly built up her chakra to form an ice mirror, but just as it started to form she felt something impact the back of her neck and her world started to spin. The last thing she saw before her world went black was a pair of remorseful golden slitted eyes staring down on her. Naruto sighed sadly as he caught the young Kunoichi in his arms. As soon as he felt Haku building up her chakra, he'd known what she was going to do and for some reason, just could not allow her to sacrifice herself to save Zabuza. He didn't know why, but the thought of seeing the girl do so made his heart clench and he'd used his newfound speed to get behind her before she had the chance to complete her jutsu and knocked her out with jab to her neck. He shook his head and looked towards the area Kakashi was fighting to see that his sensei's arm was impaled through Zabuza's chest, several of his nin dogs holding the bandaged ninja in place. Naruto sadly shook his head again as he lifted Haku up bridal style and started walking towards Kakashi as he dislodged his hand from the missing nin's chest and the dogs disappeared in a billow of smoke. She's not going to like this, but this is better than the alternative. He thought glancing down at the unconscious girl in his arms. Naruto knew Haku's reaction when she woke up and learned Zabuza was dead was going to be bad, but something inside himself, something he could not explain, told him that saving the girl was the best thing to do in this situation. He looked over to the direction of his fallen teammate and breathed a sigh of relief when he saw him sitting up and being wrapped in a hug by their other teammate, but he snickered slightly when he saw the uncomfortable expression on Sasuke's face as he tried to weasel himself out of Sakura's grasp. The needle still stuck in Sasuke's body made the image all the more humorous. He readjusted Haku slightly in his arms before turning back to Kakashi and started walking towards him. However, he didn't even make it halfway across the unfinished bridge before the sound of someone clapping echoed its way from the other side of the bridge. Turning to face the sound, Naruto's eyebrows creased when he saw the little midget known as Gato standing there with a large army of thugs behind him, all of them armed to the teeth with spears and the like. "I should have known Zabuza wouldn't be able to take care of you pesky ninja." The midget spoke glaring at the worn-out team. "I guess he wasn't much of a demon in the first place then. But no matter, I never planned on paying him in the first place. At least he made the job of taking care of the rest of you all the more easier for my men here." He gestured to the army behind him as he moved his eyes around the Konoha team. His eyes landed on the girl in Naruto's arms and his face morphed into a twisted grin. "Now kill these ninja," he ordered the men behind him, all of whom gave a roar of agreement, but Gato spoke again before they could charge. "But bring me the girl in the runt's arms. I still need to pay her back for breaking my arm and I think I know just the way to do it. You all can have what's left after I'm through with her," he ordered with a sickening grin. The thugs roared again and readied their weapons. Kakashi for his part was starting to feel a little worried. When he'd felt the dark chakra and bloodlust Naruto gave off earlier, he thought the Kyuubi was making a bid for escape and, as a result, Kakashi had pulled two jutsu he usually had in reserve to finish Zabuza off, both of which were fairly taxing on his chakra supply, and now, as he watched Gato's thugs prepare to charge, he felt his worry intensify, and for good reason. As an A-rank shinobi, Kakashi would usually be able to take out an army of thugs like this with little to no difficulty, as would many of his fellow jonin, but right now, with his reserves seriously low after his fight with Zabuza, Kakashi knew he'd be hard-pressed to take them all out without further injury to himself. As all this passed in his head, Kakashi looked around at his students. Sasuke, while still alive, was only able to stand with Sakura's support. Sakura looked more worried for the young Uchiha than their current surroundings, and Naruto looked perfectly fine, with only the remainder of his cloths signifying anything had happened to him, despite the obvious changes to his hair and body. But that did not leave Kakashi in any good thoughts about his two fighting fit students. He knew Naruto would be able to handle his own against most of the thugs here, but he would eventually be overrun by the sheer number of them, and Sakura wouldn't even stand a chance against one of them. In short, Kakashi knew they were royally screwed. However, that thought had no sooner than entered his thoughts when the feeling of bloodlust once again burst into the area. Kakashi's mismatched eyes widened when he felt the feeling and turned his eyes to Naruto to see him standing there, Haku still in his arms, his head lowered, and the black and red chakra once again starting to become visible as wisps. It was then that Kakashi caught sight of his student's eyes and had to bite back a gasp of shock when he saw how they had changed. Slowly, Naruto bent down and gently set Haku on the ground before standing back up and stepping over her to stand before her protectively. Inside his mind however Tsutsura was roaring in anger at what Gato had said, "Take my chakra hatchling. The little fuck thinks he can threaten to rape one of your mates. Tear him to shreds for even thinking it." The dragon roared in a rage. Naruto, although missing the mate part, could only agree with him. With pleasure. He nodded mentally as a smirk grew on his face, and the black chakra once again surged through his body, only this time it was more and wisps changed into bubbles of chakra flowing around him, slowly coming out of the seal, until it completely covered the red-streaked blonde in a shapeless cloak. This did not seem to dishearten the thugs as they gave another roar and charged as one. One crazy thug was faster than the rest and was ahead of them with a spear extended forward. Ha 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 ha. "I'm gonna Kai," whatever he was going to say was cut off when Naruto suddenly thrust his arm out and with it, sent out an arm made entirely out of the chakra surrounding him and impacted it against the thug. The thug was sent flying for several feet before he impacted one of the guardrails of the bridge, forcing him to come to a crashing stop. Though it was clear by the blood running from his mouth and ears the thug was dead. However, the arm of chakra did not stop there, as it continued forward and took out several more of the others, each one being sent flying before coming to a similar stop. A few flew over the side of the bridge and sank into the depths of the ocean below. It stopped about halfway through the bandit horde before returning to the blonde. The bandit stopped at this, unnerved on how several of their men were taken out. They all shivered when Naruto spoke, his voice absolutely radiating with power. "You think you can just threaten to do what you have and not suffer the consequences?" Naruto asked in a demonic voice. "Think again, Gato. Your sins have finally caught up with you and now I shall be the one to make you pay. I will be your judge, your jury, your executioner," he bellowed. Many of the bandits looked nervous now, fearful even and looked to be rethinking their decision of working for Gato, but one didn't seem to be as smart as the rest and he yelled out, "You little prick. You killed our men. Let's get him, boys." This seemed to spur the others on as they all roared in agreement again and charged once more. What they failed to realize though, was just how much power and enraged Jinchuriki possessed, especially if said Jinchuriki's tenant was the strongest of the tailed beasts. In short, the bandits were digging their own graves. Naruto growled angrily and met them halfway across the bridge. Screams, blood and gore flew through the air as the two forces met and Naruto began ripping into them, his chakra cloak acting as both his shield and sword as it cut through the thugs like butter and protected him from their weapons. It did not however stop the blood from the bandits from penetrating it and landing on his form. He let out another growl as more of Tsutsura's chakra flowed through him and he swiped his hands again, this time turning the fresh chakra into a pair of claws and slashing several thugs in half at once. They were dead long before they hit the ground and added their bodies to the growing pile of corpses. Kakashi watched all this in stunned silence as his student literally took out a whole army of bandits in only a minute. He could not believe what he was watching. Naruto, the child of his sensei, was cutting through the bandits like a hot knife through butter and only in a matter of seconds. Kakashi just could not account for what had happened to him to cause this. Though as he watched, Kakashi could not help but notice the similarities between this scene and one other he had witnessed in his life and the person who had caused it. But Kami. He thought in shock, the way Naruto is going through them all is similar to the time when I saw Kushina-sama using the Kyuubi's chakra. But it was red back then. He shivered as that last part came into his mind. It seemed whatever had affected Naruto had affected the Kyuubi as well. But his eyes Kakashi thought as the last of the bandits fell and Naruto stood on the bridge covered in their blood. His eyes made the masked Jonin shiver again, never had he seen eyes like those. What happened to you, Naruto? Normal view. Gato watched awestruck and horrified, with impossibly wide eyes visible behind his sunglasses as his men were slaughtered. His army of over 150 men was being taken out by a mere boy hardly in his teens. It just wasn't possible. The demon, the would-be dictator muttered in fright as he slowly began to back away, hoping he wouldn't be noticed by the thing that had now finished with his men and was looking at the pile of bodies with a cold stare. If he could somehow manage to get out of here and make it back to A docks, then he could take a boat and get the hell out of there. But it was for naught as the blonde suddenly turned his golden eyes to the retreating midget and vanished. Gato's eyes widened again and he turned tail to run, but fell to the ground when he impacted something mid-turn. Going somewhere? A dark voice asked, causing Gato to nearly soil himself as he turned to the speaker. Standing before him, bathed in the blood of the numerous thugs and still covered in the dark chakra cloak, was the blonde brat of the Konoha team, his golden eyes screaming for more blood. Gato gulped as he tried to shuffle away from the crimson-covered blonde. "See, can't we be reasonable?" the frightened midget asked as his body shook uncontrollably. "I can give you money, women, land, anything you want," he begged. Naruto's eye became angrier. "You dare try to bribe me?" he asked, "after everything you've done, after all the pain and suffering you've brought to people, after you've taken everything from them. You think you can escape the consequences of your actions? Think again. I am not one to be bought," he screamed, raising his arms above his head as the chakra cloak started condensing above his palms. Gato, seeing his mistake, leapt to his feet and tried to run, only to be dragged backwards as some of the chakra surrounding Naruto peeled away from the attack and grabbed the crime boss's legs and dragged him back. "No. Let me go. Stay away," he screamed in fear, too late to do anything as the attack, now no bigger than a rubber ball, finished charging. Naruto smirked sinisterly, "And now, for all the crimes you have committed against humanity, Gato, I sentence you to death," he screamed as he brought his arms down and leveled the ball of chakra at Gato. Draconic style. Chakra blast. 5, he exclaimed, calling out the name of the attack as he released it in a giant beam of energy. There was a burst of bright light as the attack fired from the ball, blinding everybody in the vicinity. There was a loud boom. As the attack was unleashed and everyone heard the last screams of Gato before they fell silent and the light died down. Opening their eyes, all those present could only gasp at the amount of damage done to the area. From the spot of the attack's focal point there was a large hole, going all the way through the concrete of the bridge, and from there was a narrow trench spanning the length of the incomplete bridge. Nothing remained of the little midget, once known as Gato, not even a piece of his clothing, so great had the attack been from up close that it incinerated him. Kakashi was amazed by how powerful the attack had been. Such a technique. He thought in amazement as he viewed the scene, as his eyes roamed around the area they eventually landed on Naruto and widened in worry. The blonde was crouched on his hands and knees and breathing heavily, the chakra cloak having receded back into the seal. "Naruto!" Kakashi exclaimed as he tried to get to his student but failed as his legs gave out and forced him onto his knees. Hearing the concerned voice of his sensei, Naruto managed to turn his head and look over in his direction. Doing so revealed that his eyes were no longer golden and were now back to their normal blue color. "I am fine, sensei. That last jutsu took more chakra than I thought it would," he grunted out as he shakily lifted himself to his legs and hurried over to Haku's unconscious form. Thankfully he'd aimed that last attack away from her and his teammates, so no one was hurt. Naruto gave a sigh of relief as he checked the girl over and found nothing had happened to her during the battle or any adverse effects were accruing because of her exposure to Tsutsura's chakra, brief as it had been. Turning back to his team, Naruto was about to speak when another voice spoke up, this one much younger than any of those present. Is the fight over already?" As the voice spoke everyone turned their attention in its direction and were stunned. There stood the entire populace of Wave, armed to the teeth with various household items. Inari and Tsunami, Tezuna's grandson and daughter, stood at the front of the large group. Each of the battle-ready villagers were looking at the destruction in front of them in shock. Though before anything more could be said or asked, a chuckling brought their attention back to the blood-covered blonde. Naruto looked around at the villagers in amusement. "Why, you're late, Inari," he muttered before he fell to the ground in a dead faint, the fatigue of unlocking his bloodline and using so much of the Nine Tails chakra finally catching up to him. Kakashi sighed as he watched his student fall to the ground unconscious. He could tell the events of this day were going to be difficult to explain to the Hokage when they got back, but for some reason, he found himself chuckling at his student's last words before he losing consciousness. Leave it to Naruto to make a situation like this amusing. But all amusement left him as his gaze landed on the unconscious body of Haku, and he sighed once more at seeing how much Naruto cared for her. He did just slaughter a literal army of men for the girl after all. Now, what are we gonna do with her? However, had Kakashi been watching, he would have seen a pair of red eyes much like one of his, watching the event of the last few moments, burning with jealousy and anger. Chapter 2. Discussions. Naruto groaned as he opened his eyes, only to shut them again when they were hit by the blinding sunlight coming in through the window on the wall next to him. Erg, he groaned again and rubbed his head. What happened? It was then that the events from the battle came back to him. Witnessing Sasuke taking the attack meant for him, meeting the fox who had turned into a dragon due to his bloodline, unlocking said bloodline, and then coming to, again to find that Haku. Naruto's eyes snapped open and he bolted straight up on the bed. Haku. He thought to himself in desperation. He didn't know what had happened to the girl after he blacked out, for all he knew Kakashi had decided that she was a threat that had to be dealt with for the sake of the mission's success. He didn't know exactly what was causing it, but something was telling him to find the girl and protect her. It was enough motivation for Naruto to throw back the blankets covering him and leap out of the bed to search for her. That is, if a hand hadn't suddenly gripped his shoulder. A vicious snarl escaping his lips, Naruto raised his hand and brought it down in a slash as he spun around to face the one who dared to stop him. Whoa. Easy there, Naruto. Kakashi yelled in surprise as he stopped his student's attack by grabbing his wrist before it could take his head off. His uncovered eye widened in surprise when he saw that Naruto's fingernails had sharpened into claws that gleamed in the early morning sunlight streaming through the window. Had he not stopped the attack when he did, Kakashi had little doubt in his mind that it would have severed his head from his body. Coming back to his senses, Naruto's eyes widened once more when he saw who he had just tried to attack. Kakashi-sensei. Yo. Kakashi smiled at his student despite the recent events and released his grip on him. However, his mind was processing the event at an insane speed as he watched Naruto lower his hand and step back from him. One thing was certain to the gray-haired ninja, Naruto was different. Are you alright? He asked after a moment. The slightest amount of concern lacing his voice. Naruto nodded. Yeah, then he remembered the reason he was getting out of bed. Where's Haku? How is she? Is she hurt? He asked rapidly, barely taking a breath between the questions, looking around as his instinct to protect once more grew out of nowhere. Kakashi smiled beneath his mask, in reverse order. No, Haku is not hurt. The same answer applies to the second since it is the same question, and she's over there. He told his student, holding up 3 fingers and taking one down with each answer until the last, and instead pointed in the direction Naruto's back was facing. Naruto turned, and immediately his heart rate calmed when he spotted Haku in a bed opposite his. Her face was calm with the bliss of sleep, and she looked as Kakashi had said. Unhurt. However, as his eyes trailed over Haku's face, Naruto noticed a square piece of paper in the center of her forehead. It was small and covered in a variety of different symbols reminiscent of scribbles and kanji. The largest of these kanji, however, was one that sat directly in the center of the paper. Naruto's eyes darkened when he realized what the paper was. Kakashi-sensei, he growled as his anger reignited. Kakashi was taken aback by the amount of killing intent being released from his student. It was comparable to that of an amateur jonin and was intense enough that it was beginning to make the older of the duo sweat. There had better be a very good reason as to why she has a ceiling tag designed to force sleep placed on her. Again, Kakashi was taken by surprise when Naruto turned his head towards him. It wasn't the glare so much as it was Naruto's eyes that startled him. They had turned the same slitted gold as they had during the bridge battle. However, as startled as he was about his student's eyes, Kakashi was far more startled to realize Naruto had recognized what the seal was designed for. How did you know what that seal does? Kakashi knew his student was half Uzumaki, but until then he had not shown any signs of understanding seals. Naruto snorted. Please. He said, startling his teacher with the amount of venom in his voice. There is so much that you and that village don't know about me. I can count the number of people who know my true abilities on one hand and still have fingers left over. And even then only old man Sarutobi really knows what I can do. Surprise was quickly beginning to become a part of Kakashi's hidden expression. And even then to say he was surprised would be the understatement of all understatements as he realized Naruto had taken a ninja's #1 rule to heart. Deception is everything. Not only had he done this, but he had even managed to fool every shinobi in Kunoichi Konoha had to offer, and they were some of the best among the 5 nations. Kakashi had a feeling not even the Anbu Corps knew as much as he was learning about his student right now. "And Naruto?" he asked, his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "What happened to you?" Naruto's glare, if it was possible, worsened and he turned to fully face his sensei. "Konoha happened," he hissed. "For 13 years I've had to put up with those fucked turds who call themselves human. They've beaten me, kicked me, stabbed, burned and starved me. They fucking hunted me." Kakashi. A black haze suddenly manifested itself around the red-streaked blonde. "I am done. I have reached my breaking point. I will not put up with them any longer. If they try to beat me, I'll break every bone in their bodies. If they try to kick me, I'll shove my foot through their skulls. If they try to burn me, then I'll melt the skin from their bones. If they try another one of their hunts, I will be the one hunting them." Naruto's body was shaking with his repressed rage, and Kakashi was tempted to run as he felt it threatening to break free. But he restrained himself as he placed a hand on his student's shoulder. The chakra haze burned at it, but Kakashi had a large pain tolerance due to his years as a shinobi. "Calm yourself, Naruto," he ordered sharply. It was rare for him to take such a tone with his students. But with who he was dealing with and everything he was learning about him today, Kakashi was taking no chances. "I was asking about your eyes," he clarified, tightening his hold as the chakra continued to burn at his hand. For a moment Naruto did nothing as he continued to shake. But then his chest heaved with a deep breath and the chakra immediately receded and the Jonin withdrew his hand, noticing that his glove had been completely eaten through in some areas and his skin was an angry red in the places it had. Naruto again snorted and turned back to Haku. "As much as you may need to know this, sensei," he bit out, "those two listening outside the door do not." Instantly there was a series of thumps and a shriek the two recognized as Sakura's from outside the door. In a second Kakashi was at the door and wrenching it open. Outside he found both of his other students in a crumpled pile on the floor. Obviously they had smashed into each other as they tried to retreat. "Out!" the Jonin barked. His lone eye was giving them a glare that dared them to protest. But Sasuke tried, but was interrupted. "I said out," Kakashi ordered in a shout, this time he channeled his own killing intent. The two genin paled dramatically and scrambled over each other in their efforts to retreat. Seeing they were gone, Kakashi slammed the door. He hated eavesdroppers. With everything going on the last few days he was beginning to wonder why he had even signed up to be a teacher in the first place. He shook his head, he could regret his actions later. Now that that's taken care of, he sighed, turning back to his arguably favorite student. "Please tell me what happened, Naruto. I should at least know that much so I can include it in my mission report." "Sit down, sensei," Naruto said, walking up and leaning against the nearest wall. He sighed, "This is going to be a long story. I'm all ears." Kakashi stated lightly, doing as suggested and sitting down on the bed Naruto had previously vacated. Naruto sighed again. "It's like this." 2 hours later, "I don't know how it happened, but it turned him, that's all I know." Naruto finished his story with a breath. Truth be told, he still couldn't believe that the 9 tails had been turned into a dragon by his bloodline. How it was even possible was lost to him as bloodlines were only supposed to affect the user. Nothing else. But given the nature of the seal used to hold Sudzurao and who made it, Naruto supposed it was possible. A few feet away and still sitting in the same spot he had been when the explanation began, Kakashi's mind was a whirlwind of activity. The fact that his formerly and still somewhat blonde student had managed to unlock a bloodline that was as old as the elemental nations themselves was surprising, yes, but not overly so considering Kakashi knew who his parents were and the clan he was descended from. Kushina had speculated Naruto would be able to when she was pregnant with him, but the possibility had been slim since her child would not have been a full Uzumaki and she herself had not been gifted with a bloodline. Kakashi was more proud than he was surprised at the fact. To him it was as if the fates were starting to make amends for giving Naruto such a messed up life as they had. Instead though, it was the fact that the Kyuubi had been transformed by this bloodline that surprised the man. It was something that should not have been possible, and as far as Kakashi knew, nothing like this had ever happened before, but his thoughts followed Naruto's on that. The seal used to seal the Kyuubi was a heavily guarded secret. The only people who knew of its complete workings were the Hokage and Jiraiya of the legendary Sannin. Not even Kakashi as the fourth's only living student was privileged to know how the Shiki Fuin worked other than the basics. To say the least, the Kyuubi turning into a dragon was not exactly what he had expected the seal to cause. Despite his surprise over the fact, Kakashi had no good feelings about it offering to help Naruto. It was a demon. One that had very nearly destroyed the village for crying out loud. How could he be sure it was trustworthy? "Are you sure you can trust it?" he asked in a low voice. His eye wavered on the area where the seal was. "Let me speak to him, Naruto." Sudzurao spoke in the blonde's mind. "Just lessen your hold on your mind for a moment and I can speak through you." Although he was reluctant to do so, Naruto complied and lessened his grip on his own mind and shortly felt as if he was a passenger inside his own body. Kakashi's eye widened drastically as the black haze returned to Naruto, and the boy's eyes changed to gold with slitted pupils. These weren't the eyes of Naruto's new bloodline, however, they radiated more power than they could have. No, these were the eyes of the Kyuubi. Before he could react, however, Naruto, or at least Naruto's body, spoke. "Greetings, Sharingan Kakashi. Hey Kyuubi." Kakashi stuttered out, sweating as he realized the Nine Tails had taken control of his student's body. Sudzurao smirked. "You got it, though that is no longer my name," he said. "However, I only want to speak with you. I have no intention of harming you or the Gaki, hey. You have my word on that, there will be no need for your weapons." Kakashi gulped. Despite the being's word, he still did not truly believe him. The fact that Kyuubi had seen his hand going for his weapons pouch unnerved him more than he already was. "Then what do you want?" he asked. Naruto's body smirked again and raised a hand in a placating, if somewhat mocking, way. "Oh, you know," he said, "I just want some access to the boy's senses and help him train with his new bloodline since I was around when it first was. I may even have him sign a summoning contract or two while I'm at it." "Huh? It's not like I want to dominate the world or anything. That's more of Shukaku's area, that guy's insane anyway." If Kakashi wasn't confused before, he was now. Huh? He could even try to wrap his head around what was going on. He couldn't tell what the fox-turned-dragon meant by that last one. Sudzurao chuckled, "I'm not joking, human. Well, mostly not. I'm serious about helping the kid out. Without his mother around to help him train in it, I'm really the only one in Konoha who can give him some direction on how to train in his bloodline. However, and speaking of which," Sudzurao's gaze suddenly turned into a glare. "I expect both you and the Hokage to give him his inheritance, including those jutsu. In my world you would have been gutted and hung by your entrails for keeping such knowledge from him. We demons may not be looked at highly by you humans, but we care for our young, and we do not hold grudges against them for something a parent has done. Besides, Naruto only wants to know who his parents are, he doesn't care what they were, or if they were rich or famous. He just wants to know their names, and believe me, he is ready to handle the knowledge." The demon informed, glaring at the man in front of him as Kakashi's head slumped. "Kyuubi-sama," Kakashi muttered under his breath, his voice was weak. Be it from the strain of the glare or from the being's demands, he didn't know. But he wanted to explain. "I already know," Sudzurao stated. "I personally don't hold it against you since your intentions in doing so were noble, but I don't like secrets being withheld from my host." The chakra around him seemed to flicker. "Damn. I thought I had a few more minutes yet," he muttered to himself before turning back to Kakashi. "Tell your Hokage about this meeting and inform him that I will not do anything to harm Naruto, the team, or the village unless otherwise provoked. Understand?" Kakashi nodded as the chakra around Naruto's body vanished and his eyes returned to their normal azure. "Huh?" The genin grunted, staggering as his mind resumed control of his body. "What the hell?" he muttered. "What was that last part, Sudzurao? You cut my connection to the conversation." "Don't worry about it yet, hatchling. It was something private I had to inform your sensei of, and it is not my place to tell you." "Fine. Now," Naruto muttered, turning his back once more on his sensei. "I'm going to wake Haku-chan up." "Wait, Naruto." Kakashi stopped him again with his hand on his shoulder, this time no chakra lashed out at him, but Naruto still turned and glared at the silver-haired man. "What?" he hissed. Kakashi gulped. That glare reminded him too much of Kushina for his comfort level. "Don't get me wrong, you can wake her up. But don't you think that she'd be more comfortable if she woke up and you were fully dressed?" "Huh?" Naruto's head quirked to the side in confusion before Kakashi pointed at his body. Looking down, Naruto's cheeks erupted in crimson once he saw he was dressed in nothing more than a pair of boxers. Said boxers did nothing to hide the fact that the red-streaked blonde was well endowed. Very much so. Through the closed door and in the lower levels of the house, the other residents heard Naruto scream. "Why didn't you tell me I was practically naked in the first place?" 2 days later, "Are you sure you have to go, Nai-san?" the sad form of Inari asked, looking up to the significantly taller Naruto. Since the day of the bridge battle and Gato's subsequent death, the child's attitude had taken a major turn for the better. Where a brooding brat had been, was once more a bright and happy child. A child that looked up to the red and blonde-haired young man in front of him. Also with Gato's death, the villagers of Wave were no longer living in fear of their families being killed should they help and had managed to complete the bridge at a faster rate than they would have otherwise. Naruto's mass spamming of shadow clones also cut down the build time, but that wasn't something that really mattered now. Naruto grinned down at Inari, internally celebrating that he could do so, since his bloodline had put his body where it should be for his 14 years. "Don't worry, brat," he said, placing a hand on the boy's head. Inari huffed as his hair was ruffled, but a smile tugged the corners of his lips at Naruto's teasing. "Wave's safe enough for me to leave now." Naruto continued playfully, "But if ever there comes a day you guys need me again, don't fret because Konoha's dragon will come. I promise. He said, this time to the surrounding crowd. Holding up his thumb in a nice guy pose as the rising sun pinched off his white teeth, his canines now more pointed than they ever had been. A few feet away Kakashi's sweat dropped at the sight. I hope Takami Naruto never runs across Guy, especially if he's ever in one of his training regiments. I don't think the village will be able to hold itself up if that happens. He thought. Mentally, Kakashi swore to himself that he would keep Naruto away from Might Guy at all costs, while at the same time picturing Naruto in a skin-tight spandex suit with orange leg warmers. The gray-haired Jonin shivered. The possibility was frightening. Shaking his head to rid himself of the horrifying image, Kakashi returned his attention to his favorite student and smiled softly. Naruto's sudden change was surprising, but it wasn't an unwelcome one in Kakashi's opinion. Gon was the loud and obnoxious brat that declared his ambitions of being Hokage every other minute, and in his place was a calm, cool and collected young man who, although somewhat withdrawn, was far more mature than his alter ego had been. Beside and slightly behind him stood the last two members of Team 7, each of them glaring daggers at the blonde. Sasuke, because no matter how much he had demanded and annoyed him, Naruto would not give away the secret to that black chakra he'd used, or his new bloodline. To top it off for the Uchiha, Kakashi was backing the dope up. Something that was supposedly a clan secret. As for Sakura, well, she didn't like Naruto on principle. To her, this new bloodline of his was a lie, and it solidified her dislike of her teammate for even coming up with the idea. Meanwhile, her head bowed and hands folded in front of her, Haku stood behind Kakashi, her eyes rimmed in red and her attitude somber. She had not taken Zabuza's death well and looked as if she just wanted to shrink into herself and vanish. As Naruto turned back to his team and they made to depart from the land of waves, he and Kakashi had one thought. The village is in for a nasty shock when we get back. I wonder what Hokage Zamajiji will say do. But said Hokage and said village a day and a half later. Hiruzen Sarutobi sat back in his chair as he watched the village of Konoha through the window of his office. Ignorant fools, he thought, sighing sadly as he watched the people go about their business. Now, you may wonder why he, the leader of the village and protector of those same people, would think this. The answer was as simple as it was crazy. The young man named Naruto Uzumaki. For the last 14 years since the boy had been born, he had lived in regret. He felt that, maybe, had he tried harder, been more firm in his actions about the boy, then Naruto would have had a much better life. A life without the beatings, without the hate. A life with friends and maybe even a family. Hiruzen sighed. I was too soft. He thought, the truth of the matter on his shoulders like a ton of bricks. The night of Naruto's birth and the subsequent release of the Kyuubi and the death of Hiruzen's successor, he had already been retired for a year and a half, living in relative comfort and a part-time advisor to the young Minato on the odd occasion. It wasn't a very long retirement, but it had been plenty to dull Hiruzen's political senses enough that when he'd retaken his hat, that he'd been too slow to stop the civilians from taking more power from the Shinobi Council and telling the public of the, at the time, newborn Jinchuriki. For the last 14 years Hiruzen had been wrestling with the civilians, trying to gain back the power he'd lost and prevent them from taking more. So far it had been a virtual standstill. At least they haven't taken any more. It was a very small comfort to the old man, but at least he knew his efforts weren't entirely useless. But with Naruto, the Hokage sighed. He'd failed Naruto in almost every way possible. He'd been unable to stop the civilians from finding out his status as a Jinchuriki, unable to stop their abuse of him, and unable to stop their attempts on his life. Hiruzen's knuckles popped as he clenched his hands, remembering that Naruto had only been 3 hours old when the first assassination attempt had taken place. Monsters. He thought, reining in his anger. Even our most hardened and emotionless shinobi know the child is but the scroll for the kunai. Really? What was so bloody difficult for the civilians to realize about that? They claimed to love the fourth, but they doubted his ability with seals when it was one of the things he was known for. It surprised the old man at how fickle civilians with nothing but a very basic knowledge of seals could be. But even then, the knowledge should have been enough for them to see that Naruto was not the Kyuubi. It should have been enough for the boy to not have gone through the hell of a childhood he had. The lone tear escaped the Hokage's eyes as he remembered another incident, the worst one. Naruto had wound up in the hospital for a week. Numerous broken bones, burns all over his body, some had even gone completely through the skin and into muscle, and severe blood loss. Somehow the Kyuubi's chakra had been slowed down to a point where it healed Naruto's wounds at a much slower rate than it had in previous times. Other times Naruto had only required a night or two's stay at the hospital before being able to leave. But this time it had required a full week for him to heal, even though it was still much faster than it would have been for someone else. To this day Hiruzen still had no idea how the boy's attackers had managed to slow the flow of Kyuubi's chakra enough to stall Naruto's healing so much. Over time it had picked up to what it once had been, but Hiruzen still wondered. Despite this though, Hiruzen couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at the thought of the boy. Naruto had grown into the type of person that was quickly becoming a rarity in the shinobi world. a true shinobi. That mask he had crafted around himself and his abilities was an ingenious use of the shinobi's only true rule. Hiruzen smirked. Although it was true that he wasn't exactly happy with the way Naruto had been brought up, it was what molded the young man into what he was today. Naruto was anything but the dead last that he had led others to believe, and if it hadn't been for those damned civilians, Hiruzen would have promoted Naruto to genin long before he had been. Though if the aged Kage was honest with himself, Naruto was much more skilled than a genin. At the worst, Hiruzen would say he was borderline chunin. It had been almost a year since the last time Hiruzen had managed to make enough time to ask Naruto for a demonstration of his skills. In all reality, Naruto could have surpassed that assessment months ago. Especially now that he knew the Shadow Clone Jutsu. The only thing limiting that jutsu was the user's chakra levels, and Naruto had that stuff to spare. Enough that making a few dozens or even hundreds of the things seemed like nothing to him. Though given who his mother was, Hiruzen wasn't surprised at the boy's chakra reserves, even without the Kyuubi's own feeding them, they were, in a word, gigantic. Truth be told, Hiruzen's own Hokage-sama. Said Hokage's inner thoughts were interrupted when there was a knock on his office door rang across them, followed quickly by his secretary's voice. Yes. The aged man called, turning away from the window. Pardon the interruption, but Team 7+1 has just returned from their mission and is requesting an audience. +1. The Kage wondered as an eyebrow rose on his aged forehead before giving the okay for them to be let in. Kakashi entered first, his posture relaxed, but his usual orange book nowhere to be seen, causing Hiruzen further interest. Usually the cycloptic jonin would have had his nose buried in it, even in meetings with the village leader. The fact that it wasn't told the Hokage something serious was up. Up next there was Sasuke and Sakura, nothing unusual seemed to be wrong with them, other than them being annoyed at something. Then came Naruto, trailed by a girl with long dark hair and a blue kimono, who had her head bowed and looked as if she wanted to disappear. It wasn't the girl that got Hiruzen's attention though, instead it was Naruto. The boy had grown at least 2 feet in height and his body had gained some significant muscle mass than the last time Hiruzen had seen him. The most surprising thing about him to the Hokage though was the fact that the boy's eyes now had vertically slitted pupils and his whisker marks were much less pronounced than they had been when he had left for the mission. Had it not been for the boy's eyes and his whiskers still being slightly visible, Hiruzen could have sworn he was seeing the fourth reincarnation walking into his office. Not letting his surprise show any more than a raised eyebrow, Hiruzen rose to his feet and greeted the team. "Welcome back Team 7. I presume the mission was a success?" he asked, directing his attention to Kakashi. "Yes, Hokage-sama," Kakashi spoke to affirm his leader. "However, there were some unforeseen circumstances that you must be made aware of and of a discovery regarding one of my genin." The Hokage nodded for Kakashi to continue. If he was right, then the discovery Kakashi mentioned had something to do with Naruto's new look. The debriefing that followed was something Hiruzen was not expecting to hear from one of his most seasoned and prized jonin. 20 minutes later, Naruto smirked at the Hokage's stunned expression, even though the briefing had ended just a few seconds prior. Hiruzen's face was almost something to laugh at. Almost being the keyword as he was no longer hiding his true personality. "I see." The Hokage muttered after several long moments of silence. "Kakashi," he spoke, calling his jonin to attention. "Yes, Hokage-sama." Sasuke and Sakura were somewhat shocked at how serious their sensei was being at the time, as they had never seen him as such. "You will escort Team 7 minus Naruto here to their homes. What they have learned over the course of this debriefing is an A-class secret until it is deemed otherwise by myself or Naruto. Make sure they do not reveal this information to anyone." "Understood." "Yes sir." Kakashi responded, snapping his leader a salute and moving to take the other 2 members of the team to their homes. Sasuke, however, was having none of this. In his mind Naruto was receiving special attention from the leader of the village instead of him for being the last loyal Meiliche. "Now wait just a minute," he exclaimed, his temper finally having boiled over. Instantly he was blasted with an intense amount of killing intent. Not just from his sensei but from said leader himself. The amount coming from Kakashi was nothing compared to what was coming from the Hokage and outclassed that of what he had felt from Zabuza during their first confrontation. It was enough to freeze the male in his tracks. "Is there a problem, genin?" Hiruzen asked, adding the emphasis on the word and adding a blast of extra intent to remind said genin of his position. Sasuke swallowed. "And no, Hokage-sama." He stuttered, turning pale and allowing Kakashi to lead him and Sakura out of the office. Once the door had shut and the security seals set for privacy between the 3 remaining in the office, Hiruzen turned back to his surrogate grandson and the girl with him. "So," he began, folding his hands under his chin. This was both a good and bad thing for the village, good in the fact that it had regained a lost bloodline and bad because it would cause certain secrets that had been kept secret for the villages and Naruto's protection. "What are you not telling me?" Naruto smirked and sat down in the chair opposite the desk. "Jiji, meet Haku." he said, motioning his head to the girl behind him. The Hokage eyed the girl behind his surrogate grandson as she seemed to come to life for the first time since entering his office. The girl lifted her head to meet the man's eyes, revealing her own to be a chocolate brown and rimmed in red, as if she had silently been crying the entire time. She bowed just as quickly in respect. "Hokage-sama." She spoke in a voice that was just barely a whisper. "My name is Haku, and I humbly ask for asylum within Konoha so that I may better serve Naruto-sama." Hirizin's head jerked back to Naruto in surprise. The red-streaked blonde was burying his shaking head into his hands to hide his face. "She thinks she has to be my servant since I spared her life instead of taking it in wave," Naruto explained to the man's unasked question. "Believe me, I don't want her to be, but she won't accept it any other way." Hiruzen nodded to the explanation. He'd seen stranger cases in his long life, but hoped the girl would eventually see herself as something more than just a servant. "I see," he said, propping his elbows on his desk and tapping his fingertips together in front of his face. "And would you like to join us as a shinobi?" he asked. The girl looked up with a sharp intake of air, her eyes darted from Naruto to the aged cage and back again. Naruto sighed and inclined his head. "I won't make this decision for you, Haku," he told her. "It's your life, I'm not going to force anything on you, should you not want to do something." I would like to join as a shinobi," Haku said, nodding to the one she thought of as a master, "however, my skills have always been better suited for healing rather than fighting." She was interrupted by a snort from the black-streaked blonde. "Please, Haku. Those needles of yours hurt like hell, and I could barely see you moving before I got the Rasengan." Naruto smirked as he saw the girl's face turn pink as she turned her head away from him. Hiruzen chuckled at the two's interaction. He could see the girl was still in mourning of Zabuza, but he could tell Naruto was helping to ease the pain of losing someone she thought of as precious. "Be that as it may, Naruto," he said to Uzumaki. "There are several courses in the hospital Haku may undergo if she wishes to enroll as a medical kunoichi, which is something the village has a severe lack of at the moment." Naruto nodded with the ghost of a smile on his face as he relented to the aged leader of the Leaf. He had no issues with Haku becoming a Mednin, he just enjoyed teasing her. "Is that agreeable, Haku-san?" Hiruzen asked kindly to the ice user. Haku nodded, a small smile on her face for the first time in days. "It is, Hokage-sama. I am much happier healing than I am fighting." "Very well then," the Hokage said and dug a flyer out of a pile on the desk before offering it to the girl to take. "Report to the front desk of the hospital in 2 days' time and give this flyer. The attendant there shall escort you to the correct doctor to begin your training," he instructed. Haku nodded and took the offered flyer before retaking her spot behind Naruto. "Now, how about we discuss the other thing you aren't telling me?" Chapter 3. Now, how about we discuss the other thing you're not telling me? Naruto's humor dried up when the Hokage brought his attention back to the genin. "Judging by how Kakashi skirted around the subject, I feel this has something to do with your tenant." Hiruzen mused to the teen. A grimace passed over his features at Naruto's slow nod. "Haku already knows," Naruto said. "I told her once she made it clear that she wasn't going to accept being anything other than a servant. Figured she should at least know that much before she made any definite decisions," he explained. The aged leader's eyes widened by just a fraction at the admission, but the nod he received from the ice user upon looking at her put much of his unease about it to rest. "I don't think we can really call him Kyuubi anymore though, to be honest, Gigi." Naruto went on and quickly explained everything that Kakashi had left out from his own report. Once his explanation was finished, Naruto and by proxy Haku were treated to a sight that not very many in living memory had been privileged to. Hiruzen Sarutobi was completely baffled. For the first time in a long time, the Hokage of the Hidden Leaf was at a loss of something to say. To think that the awakening of an ancient bloodline could cause such a change to a creature as powerful as the Kyuubi, a being that was practically a natural disaster, it was unheard of. But if the Rasengan was as powerful as what Kushina had explained it to be all those years ago, and what Naruto was now corroborating it to be, then Hiruzen could believe it, if only just. At the back of his mind, however, he had a feeling the seal holding the beast was at least somewhat responsible for the fox transforming as well. Hiruzen's eyes trailed up to the photo of his successor as a frown took hold on his face. The seal Minato had used was the strongest in existence, having been designed by the Shinigami itself. How it worked was still not fully understood to even the world's foremost sealing experts, a group that included both himself and his student Jiraiya. "I suppose you are right in that regard, Naruto-kun." The Hokage chuckled, deciding to ponder on his thoughts at a later time. "Calling Kyuubi by that title does feel off. But should word of this leak out to the village, I fear you shall be even more ostracized than you already are." He frowned, once again reminded of his failures. "I already must inform the council of your bloodline. I doubt they'll be able to handle this news on top of it." Naruto nodded. He could already hear the civilians calling for his head at the idea of him having even the littlest amount of power. He didn't need the headache that would be caused by the information the fox itself had been affected to get spread around. Speaking of which, I'm dropping the mask, Gigi. He said, I'm sick of the abuse. Any more hunts and there's gonna be new graves to be filled. The glare that met the Hokage's eyes was fierce, determined. Hiruzen knew Naruto wasn't joking, and honestly, he was relieved. He nodded his consent, about time. Very well. Hiruzen said. The council won't be happy about this, but I will warn them that messing with you will have severe consequences if there's anything left of them. He smirked darkly to his adoptive grandson. It was time the villagers learned to not mess with a shinobi of Konoha, especially if that shinobi was a Jinchuriki. It was shortly after that and being informed that they would be summoned at a later date to reveal their respective bloodlines that Naruto and Haku left the old man to his mountain of paperwork. Later at Naruto's apartment, home sweet home. Naruto muttered quietly as he led Haku through the door to his apartment. There really wasn't much to see if he were completely honest with himself. The apartment itself only had 2 rooms, the one they were in being a combined living room and kitchen, one terminating into the other around the center of the room. In the living room section there was a couch and a small table on one wall and a bookshelf along the far wall, next to which were a set of doors, one leading into Naruto's bedroom, the other to the small bathroom. The kitchen wasn't much better, but it had a table and chairs, in addition to what was normally part of a kitchen setup. Naruto found himself waiting with bated breath as he watched Haku eye the room around them. Several long moments passed before she finally returned her focus to him. This is where you live? She asked slowly. He nodded, unsure of how to respond. Do you like it? Naruto asked, looking around the sparsely decorated room. He hated being nervous around people, but having visitors to his home was a rare occurrence, outside of the villagers' fox hunts anyway. There was a low growl coming from the back of Naruto's mind at the thought of the foolish actions of the Konoha populace, but he shut the dragon out. That stuff could wait for now. Strange. Haku mused, confusing the red-streaked blonde. I had imagined it would be messy, since a teenage boy lives here. A small smile was tugging at the edges of her lips. Naruto's face became deadpan, but a chuckle escaped him. You'd think I would be. Truth be told, I was for a while. But there was only so long I was able to live in a pigsty before realizing I had to make a change. Haku nodded, the amusement in her eyes bringing Naruto's mind a sense of relief. It was the most emotion he'd seen from the ice user since the bridge battle. Well, besides gloom that is, but Naruto wasn't going to complain about it. He was about to open his mouth to say something else, but was stopped when he felt something off in the distance, something that made him snap his mouth shut instantly. Uh-oh. Naruto thought, grimacing at the agitated signatures he felt in that direction and how quickly they were approaching. He had to move fast if he didn't want to be nearly impaled by the sword one of them carried. I gotta go, Haku. He said, turning to the girl from the window he'd been staring through. But Naruto-sama, the ice user froze as the boy turned and stared at her fiercely, a small grin on his lips. Trust me. He said. And just like that he was gone, his form simply having vanished from the spot he'd been standing in a second before. For the life of herself, Haku couldn't move after having seen that stare. It had filled her with a sense of ease the ice user had never felt before. Seeing it had made it feel like everything was right with the world. It was something Haku had not seen or felt since the first time she had met Zabuza. Tears threatened to spill from her eyes at the thought of the man and the loss of him, but Haku held them in. She'd spent enough time crying over the dead, it was time to move on and make a fresh start. But why had her face felt as if it was on fire when she'd seen the look Naruto had given her? You know, hatchling. Sudzurao muttered to his host, watching through the boy's senses as he leapt across the rooftops of Konoha. You have one of the strongest bloodlines in the world, something only being matched by one other, so how is it you are so scared of 2 teenage girls? He asked, watching as Naruto threw himself to the left to dodge a kunai aimed for his shoulder. 2 things? Naruto thought back, glancing behind him at his pursuers, only to be met by a shuriken nearly missing his cheek. One of them has eyes that can see all the spots needed to cause pain without leaving a mark and also processes the skills to hit those marks without being seen doing so. 2. Holy. Naruto's explanation was cut off by his own yell when a ball of fire screamed up to him, only to miss him and disintegrate the log he managed to replace himself with. Satsuki. He muttered, crouching on a tree branch some distance away. You've gotten a lot better with that fireball technique. He gulped when he realized what would have happened if it had hit him. You were saying? Sudzurao prodded with a sigh at the girl's antics with his host. Oh yeah. 2. The other has an absurdly strong affinity for fire, as seen here. And is a pyro on top of it who loves to test her new techniques on me. Naruto mentally wept, cursing his luck at training partners. The dragon could only sweat drop at the explanation. Only in Uzumaki, he muttered. Naruto could only continue to hide as he watched Hinata and Satsuki leap around looking for him. Damn it. I thought we had him. Satsuki screamed in outrage, slamming a fist into the palm of her hand. Hinata shook her head at her best friend and love rival. She could not understand the girl's love of fire and testing it out on their blonde crush. "Did something seem different about him to you, Satsuki-chan?" she asked. "Naruto-kun doesn't normally run from us when we surprise him." Her voice had an edge to it as she had seen another person in Naruto's apartment with him using her Byakugan, a female person, and it had irked both of them to no end. Well, Satsuki paused as she mulled it over. "Now that I think about it. Something about Naruto-kun did seem off, but I couldn't tell what since he was running." Hinata inclined her head, she had thought as much too, but before she could say anything both girls felt the cold metal of a blade press against their necks, poised to sever their jugulars if the holder so pleased. "You're dead, ladies." A voice that sounded so familiar to them muttered in each of their ears and sent pleasant shivers down both Hinata's and Satsuki's spines. "Shit. They thought as one. Gotta try harder than that if you want to get the drop on me. Especially when I have company," Naruto said, withdrawing the blades and stowing them in his kunai pouch. He sounded a little annoyed at the last bit though. As one the girls turned to face him and gasped at seeing his new looks, but at the same time their faces lit up like a tomato. "What happened to you, Naruto-kun?" Chapter 4. Reconnecting with old friends. Hinata was at odds with herself. Her longtime crush and secret friend had just arrived back to Konoha from his team's first C rank, only he didn't return the same as when he'd left. His sun-kissed blonde hair was now stained with patches of red, his body was noticeably more fit than it had been before his mission, and instead of being the same height as her, he was now at least a foot taller than either her or Satsuki, who admittedly was several inches taller than Hinata as well. Hinata wasn't sure exactly what she had expected to happen to Naruto in the Land of Waves, but it certainly had not been to have turned into the Adonis of a male she saw before her. She didn't know how to react. Nor could she shake that funny feeling growing in her stomach as she imagined all the possible ways she could get Naruto's shirt off. So instead she asked, "What happened to you, Naruto-kun?" Naruto flinched at the question, but knew he should have been expecting it. Even an idiot would have noticed the changes his bloodline had brought him if he'd gone away as a shrimp and came back like he was now, and the girls in front of him were the furthest things from idiot someone could be. Naruto felt his throat dry up at the question. He'd never told them of his Jinchuriki status after he discovered it for himself, and he wasn't sure how he could spin the story without either of them finding out. Not that he didn't want to tell them, he did, but to Naruto it wasn't the right time. Especially after his changes. He didn't want them blaming the event on Suzuro, even if it was a logical conclusion due to his bloodline not being commonly known about. For now Naruto heard the dragon mummer in the seal. The words brought a strange sense of paranoia to the red-streaked blonde. Something about what the dragon said sounded oddly eerie. He shrugged the feeling off. He could think about their meaning when he got home, for now he had an explanation to produce for two increasingly expectant-looking girls. Well, you see, he stuttered, feeling nervous under their gazes. It turns out I have a bloodline." He spat out, much to Satsuki and Hinata's shock. "The bloodline?" Satsuki asked. Her voice portraying the surprise she felt at the announcement. Naruto nodded and quickly launched into an explanation of the events leading up to the Draconic Blood's awakening, excluding the parts involving Suzuro, and other than that he left nothing out about what he had discovered or been told of his bloodline. By the time he was finished each of the girls had an odd look on their face. "Wow." Satsuki muttered, odd that such a bloodline existed. "Ha. Take that, Sasuke. I told you Naruto-kun was special." She thought triumphantly, imagining what her twin must have looked like when he'd found out about his teammates' new abilities. As odd as she was from the Draconic Blood, Satsuki was more satisfied that her brother finally had something that would knock his arrogant attitude down a few pegs. Beside her, Hinata was in a similar state of thought. Her father had always been critical of her, having wanted a male instead of a weak female. Hiashi's harshness was always worse when it came to the company Hinata kept. If she strayed and played with regular civilian children instead of other clan heirs and heiresses, he criticized her choice of playmates for being of the inferior sort. These criticisms were often accompanied by brutal training sessions where Hinata was left in a heap on the floor, tired and sore from his strikes. However, when it came to Naruto, Hiashi had been particularly harsh the first and only time she'd been caught around him. The training session had been the most brutal Hinata had ever experienced. Hiashi had dueled her into the floor, giving her no warning and no indication of an incoming strike. He'd all but butchered her by the time the session had finished and not even looked back at the bloody mess of his oldest daughter as he'd walked away. "If you associate with trash, you will be treated like trash," he'd said. Fierceness burned in Hinata's eyes as she remembered that day. She didn't know why the older generation seemed to hate Naruto, but that day something in her had snapped and she had decided that they would all regret having doubted her and the boy who had been so kind to her at the expense of his own well-being. Since then, and at her own behest once she tracked him down and explained what had happened, Naruto and herself had been training in secret, each being the other's source of encouragement and determination. They'd welcomed Satsuki into their fold the following year after the Uchiha massacre, having seen how her brother had treated her during the academy lessons and knowing she needed a friend, and during the following years they played the village like a fiddle, making the adults, and in Hinata's case her clan, look like the fools they were. The three of them were the strongest in their age group but had decided to hide it for the right time. Hinata played the weak and meek girl that she had been before the training session with her father. Naruto acted like the orange-obsessed idiot that declared his dream of being Hokage at every chance he got, and Satsuki was the shy twin of the last male Uchiha. The only people who knew of their ruse were themselves, the Hokage, and Satsuki's mother Mikoto. Now though, Hinata knew things were about to change. Naruto's new bloodline all but assured that, and she looked forward to it. Finally. She thought, clenching her fists in anticipation. It was almost too much to contain, especially once she imagined the reactions of her father and the clan elders. This means we can stop hiding, right? Hinata's voice surprised herself as she had not even realized she'd started speaking. Beside her, Hinata felt more than saw Satsuki's questioning if not eager look. Naruto's smirk was all the answer they needed. Greetings, honorable council. Hiruzen said as the council of Konoha filed in through the door of the conference room and split into their sides of the room. Greetings, Hokage-sama. The clan heads returned with nods of their heads. Leaders of their clans as they were, they still respected their village leader. The civilians, on the other hand, only nodded their heads in the barest of acknowledgements to the Hokage. Hiruzen's smile tightened ever so slightly at the disrespect shown by the arrogant civilians, but he pushed it down as he remembered the reason for the meeting he'd called them to. I'm going to enjoy this. He thought, resisting the urge to smirk at the thought. The room was full of mutterings and the scrapping of chairs as civilians and ninja-like moved to take their seats in the room. Once they had, Hiruzen cleared his throat to begin speaking. What is the reason we've been called here, Hokage-sama? Only to be interrupted by one of the civilian council members, one of the most vocal and power-hungry, he noted with disdain as he glared at the pink-haired woman. If you could hold your tongue for a moment, Councilwoman Haruno, I was getting to it. He growled, blasting the woman with a minuscule amount of his killing intent. It seemed to work on her as she shrunk back with a scared nod. Seeing this reaction from their leader, the clan head smirked knowingly to the civilians. They realized the old man was getting his flame back and gearing up to wrestle the civilians back to their proper spot on the village food chain. As I was saying, Hiruzen began again, flaring his intent in case anyone dared to interrupt him again. I have called you all here today to inform you that a bloodline long thought extinct has resurfaced in one of our genin during their latest mission outside the village. Normally, such an announcement would have been met with a chorus of cheers and questions at the prospect of a new bloodline, but as Hiruzen was still flooding the room with intent, no one, especially the civilians, dared to ask a single question about it. The clan heads were content to sit in the silence and wait for their leader to explain more. I have spoken with the genin in question, and he has asked that news of his bloodline be kept secret from the majority of the village, however Uzumaki-san. The room exploded into roars of denial from the civilian council when Hiruzen said the name of the genin. They were the same as they always were whenever Naruto was mentioned. Calling for his death, the demon cannot be allowed to gain power and more. The Hokage rolled his eyes hearing all this for the 9th time, before once again blasting the room with killing intent. This time however he let far more than he had before loose. He'd purposely let Naruto's name loose just so he could have an excuse to do what he'd wanted for a long time. Enough. He roared back at them standing from his seat. Anbu. He called. Instantly, there were several bursts of smoke as the hooded figures appeared on either side of the council table. Yes, Hokage-sama. The quiet voice of Nico asked as she kneeled before him. Escort these fools from this room. I am fed up with their bigotry and power-hungry ways. He ordered, despite the sputtering civilians trying to prevent it. As of this instant the civilian council is disbanded. He announced they will each be held in prison cells pending the results of audits of their accounts and their comparisons to the village finances. Hiruzen smirked as every one of the now former council members went white as a sheet. He had a feeling that several of them would be getting escorted to the executioner's block by the end of the week. Hi, Hokage-sama. Nico coursed as she and her team disappeared with the civilians in clouds of smoke. During the whole event the ninja side of the room could only smirk, even Shikaku Nara, who was perpetually sleeping whenever there was a meeting as it was too boring otherwise, was awake with a smirk. Collectively they all shared the same thought. About time. Several hours later Hiruzen sat at his desk, a thoughtful look on his face as he went over the meeting that had followed the civilians' exit from the chambers. After the civilians had left, or rather had been forced from, the room, the rest of the meeting had gone relatively smoothly. Questions had been asked and answers had been given, or at least as much as Hiruzen knew Naruto would be comfortable in telling them, which was as little as possible. Pretty much it had been a standard meeting, something the aged Hokage had not had for several years. However, as he contemplated the meeting, something nagged at him. Decades of being a shinobi, and even more so of being a village leader, had ingrained into him a certain sense of suspicion. Hiruzen knew each of the clan leaders were loyal to the village and him and would die to protect the leaf and all her peoples. However, when it came to Naruto, the Nara, Akimichi, Inuzuka and Uchiha clans were the only ones the elder Sarutobi knew he could trust with the boy. The thing nagging at him then was not one of those four clans. Rather, as the meeting had gone on, Hiruzen's eyes had been drawn to the leader of the Hyuga. Hiashi's expression, like always, had been indifferent, but Hiruzen had learned how to read beneath someone's expression. During the meeting Hiashi's face had said it all. He was not happy with the news, not in the least. This had been surprising to the aged Hokage, as he had thought Hiashi would have been one of those that could understand Naruto's position, since the man's clan used the caged bird seal. Apparently not, he muttered, deciding he would have to watch the Hyuga head closely for the foreseeable future. For now though, the Hokage gained a mischievous look in his eyes as he reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a bright orange book. For the next few hours the room was filled with the man's giggles as he read his student's book. How did this happen? Sudzurao asked in bemusement at his host's predicament. Satsuki Naruto thought back, weeping quietly at his state as he made his way back to his apartment in Haku. If one were to look at the young man right that moment, they'd be forgiven for thinking that he'd just been put through a meat grinder inside a volcano and underwater. His clothes were shredded to pieces and damp in some places, but smoldering in others. Naruto looked down at his pants and mentally wept, picturing the particularly large and hot fireball Satsuki had almost got him with. The cloth of one of legs ended at the knee when he'd not been fast enough to completely dodge it with a substitution. Sudzuro sighed in exasperation. Naruto was quickly developing an aversion to fire. Not completely unreasonable considering the company he kept and their use of the stuff, but still one would think with his new bloodline Naruto would be more tolerant of it. And what did we learn? The dragon asked, remembering exactly what had led to his host's condition. Never let a girl sneak up behind you. Naruto thought back, causing Sudzuro to sigh. Baka. He muttered, then thought better of it as Satsuki had technically snuck up behind Naruto and caught him by surprise. Close enough. The two turned their attention to the outside world and those that had begun following Naruto. How are you going to deal with them? Like I told the old man earlier, Naruto replied, running a finger over the blade of a kunai in his pocket. They're trying this shit again. I'm gonna make them think twice before doing it again. He made a sudden left into an alleyway and the sizable crowd behind him hurried to follow after him, only to be left gaping when they found their target gone and only a wall standing where he should have been. You know, a voice said from behind them, I haven't even been back a day yet and already you guys try this. Naruto said, his arms crossed and a scowl present on his face. The crowd of villagers glared at him and several readied mallets or pipes or even pieces of wood. This is the end for you, Kyuubi brat. One of them yelled. Wow. Naruto's voice dripped with sarcasm and venom. Going with that old line. Haven't heard that one in a while. The villagers either didn't care or were too stupid to notice that Naruto wasn't cowering like he normally did. Several of them moved to ready themselves, but a sudden feeling of dread washed over them and stilled their feet. I've gotten real tired of being chased and beaten by you idiots. Naruto said, summoning a trio of shadow clones. So let me give you this warning, your only warning. Together, the four Narutos activated the Rasengan. Their golden eyes spelled horrible and gruesome deaths for each of those in the crowd. Come after me again and you'll die. He turned to walk away, but something whizzed by his head, thrown at him by one of the drunks in the crowd. Don't you turn your back on us, Kyuubi. You must pay for what you've done. What I've done? Naruto whispered, his voice seemed to carry much further than it would have normally. It sent shivers down the spines of several of the civilians as Naruto turned back to the crowd. All I have ever done to you is ask for a little recognition. All you do is see what the Yondaime sealed into me, not me, the one saving all your sorry asses. His eyes glowed with rage and his blood was boiling as the civilians stood frozen. He took a deep breath in order to rein it and his intent in. Think whatever you like. He scoffed, I'm done giving a damn. He turned again and disappeared into thin air. But a whisper rang out for them all to hear. You've been warned. Slowly the civilians managed to regain their mobility and work their ways out of the alley to do whatever it is they do. He has some incredible control over his emotions, that's for sure. Kurenai, he muttered to the other two jonin with her. Yeah, pretty amazing. I wouldn't have blamed him for beating them all to a pulp though. Why the hell did he? I would have summoned my snakes to rip them a new one. Of course you would have, Anko. The second voice said with a tone of exasperation to the third. I would have sicked my hounds on them if it got to that point. Anko, Hana, enough. Kurenai said before the two could carry on any further. She knew they both loved watching a good fight or joining in on a good fight, either worked for them. We should just be happy things didn't escalate any further than a bottle being thrown. The two groaned, but neither said anything as they all disappeared in a whirl of leaves and smoke. One of the three hesitated for just a second longer. taking that time to breathe in the dominating scent of the red-streaked blonde and sighing and longing. Soon, Naruto-kun. Chapter 5. The exams are coming, Hinata proves a point. Naruto sighed to himself as he laid on a branch of the tree at the center of Training Ground 7. How have they not realized? He thought, ignoring the pacing of his pink-haired teammate on the ground below. Below him, Sasuke and Sakura either leaned against a tree or were pacing around it. Sasuke looked bored, or as bored as he could look while he glared into the distance, and Sakura was looking more annoyed with each passing moment. Where the hell is he? Birds scattered into the sky as the girl's temper finally boiled over into an ear-piercing screech. Again, Naruto sighed, rubbing his ringing ears and turning his attention to the presence he felt a distance away in the neighboring forest. Kakashi had been there for over an hour already, either reading his orange book or watching them. Naruto didn't know for certain, but he was betting on the latter of the two options. Not like anything will happen. He thought, knowing full well what their sensei was watching for wouldn't happen. The one-eyed user of the Sharingan was waiting to see if the three of them would begin interacting in a more friendly manner and finally begin being an actual team. Obviously, that wasn't going to happen. Nor would it anytime soon. Naruto knew that from past experiences of trying to get his teammates to open up so they could begin building trust in each other. Their reactions to his prompting had been as expected. Sasuke had grunted and gone back to his brooding, while Sakura had attempted to reintroduce her fist to the formerly blonde Genin's head. Attempted being the key word here, as Naruto would quickly produce and then switch with a clone to avoid being hit. The clone would only disperse once it had collapsed and been switched back with the original, who would appear in an equally collapsed state in order to keep up appearances. Of course, that still left Naruto's head ringing from the force of the girl's hit, as even a clone wasn't able to fully take it without some being transferred to the creator, but that was still much better than being the one to actually take the hit. It had taken several times of that exact scene taking place for Naruto to throw in the towel and abandon the idea of his team getting their act together. If his teammates didn't want to talk, fine, he'd work on other things. Normally, on days like today when the team wouldn't be doing anything except for a few D ranks and teamwork building exercises, Naruto would send a clone in his place to the training grounds. He made sure to pack these clones to the brim with extra chakra to ensure they survived through the missions and the following training. Meanwhile, the real Naruto would be training elsewhere, either on his own or with Satsuki and Hinata, since their team was normally finished for the day long before his was. At some point, normally when Kakashi dismissed them, Naruto's clone would dispel, letting the original know everything it experienced through the day and leaving Sasuke and Sakura with no idea they'd been with a clone the entire time. Today, however, Naruto was content to lay on his branch and wait for Kakashi to make his appearance. He was busy reminiscing on the meal Haku had prepared for breakfast that morning. Haku's food is the best I've ever had in my life. He thought, remembering the way it had made his taste buds explode in ways he'd never thought they could. Remembering breakfast made him think on what would be for dinner that night. The ice user had said something about a stew. He shook his head. He didn't need to be focusing on the food Haku made, good as it might be. Haku's personality had begun to emerge again over the time she'd been in Konoha. She still had her moments of sadness, especially whenever Naruto broached the subject of her past and Zabuza, but she was still well beyond being the emotional wreck she'd been when they'd returned to the village. Sakura's temper once again reached its limit and drew Naruto out of his reminiscing. He sighed for a third time and jumped from his branch to land in front of his teammates in a crouch, startling them as he turned his attention to the tree line. Alright Kakashi-sensei, you better come out now. I don't think Sakura's going to be able to hold off going on a rampage for much longer. He stood up and stretched his limbs as the other two watched their gray-haired sensei appear out of the tree line from the direction Naruto had been speaking in. Wa Naruto baka. Sakura screamed in rage, raising her fist to hit him, but Naruto simply stepped to the side and walked back to the tree as Sakura fell flat on her face from the momentum of her fist. Kakashi approached his Genin squad slowly, his orange book in his face as usual, but his eye was focused on his team, gauging their behavior and how they had been since returning from wave. By far Naruto had changed the most, not just physically, but now that he was letting the world see who he was, it was clear that he changed mentally as well. Kakashi had always suspected there was something more to his blonde Genin, especially since he'd been switching himself with his clones for several months now. Kakashi didn't mind him doing so either, the clones' memories were transferred to the original once they were dispelled, so why not let Naruto abuse them for team meetings and go train himself. As for the other two under his command, however, neither had matured much since the mission to Wave. Kakashi was at a loss of what to do with them and how to make them see that they needed to work together to survive in the world once they advanced in rank. Speaking of which, I'm surprised Naruto, I didn't realize you were a censor. He said, keeping his tone light as he stowed his book in his hip pouch. He watched as the boy shrugged his shoulders indifferently and stood by the tree, ignoring the glares being sent his way from his teammates. Just gotta know how to do it. Kakashi heard him mutter in response, he nodded to himself and mentally noted it as another thing Naruto had been hiding. Clearing his throat, Kakashi turned to address the team as a whole. Now, before we begin the day's activities, I feel it's best that you know I have signed you three up for the Chunin exams. He paused to gauge their reactions. The Chunin exams? They're coming here? Sasuke asked. Kakashi nodded, feeling worried about the look of hunger on the Uchiha's face. Yes, he responded, shaking the worry away for the moment. Taking these exams will allow you three the chance to show your skills off to the village and the dignitaries who come to watch. Should you pass, you'll have earned the chance at a promotion to the rank of Chunin. Kakashi reached into his hip pouch and produced 3 slips of paper. These are the forms you'll need to sign in order to enter. If you decide to, then you'll have to be at the academy in 2 days for the first of the exams. Taking his form, Naruto felt a surge of determination through his body. This was his chance to prove that he had what it took to advance, if not for the important ones in his life then for himself. He signed the paper and handed it back to Kakashi without a second thought. It was shortly after that Sasuke did likewise, and a few moments later that a hesitant-looking Sakura did too. Kakashi studied his students again, determined to make them as ready as he could in the 2 days they had until the exams. Stowing both his book and the 3 forms back in his pouch, he began to raise his intent, letting the 3 know he was serious. Alright then, now we train. Naruto grunted as we made his way through the village several hours later. Kakashi's training had been brutal for the genin of Team 7. The first thing the silver-haired jonin had made them do was run 100 laps around the training grounds and then spared each of them in order to test their stamina and ability. He'd limited them to only jutsu in order to better judge them. Out of the 3 of them, Sakura had fared the worst. Having complained the entire time, the pink cat had collapsed into a sweaty heap after her 3rd lap. The sparring had been even worse for her, as the basic academy style she used had quickly been picked apart by Kakashi. Even then, Naruto could tell the man had been going easy on the girl, but the fact that she hadn't even been able to hold her own was disappointing. Sasuke had fared much better, having come from a clan, he'd been used to long, grueling workouts. Sadly, and although the laps had only winded him, he hadn't been able to put up much of a fight against their sensei. Of course, being unable to use chakra in the spar also meant Sasuke hadn't been able to use his Sharingan with his clan's Taijutsu style. Odds were it wouldn't have helped, Kakashi had experience with the eye and knew how to counter it. Finally, when Naruto's turn for sparring had come up, everyone had been surprised at how well he'd been able to keep up with Kakashi. The blonde spar had lasted much longer than either of his teammates. Eventually though, Kakashi had still outmaneuvered the genin before ending the fight and passing judgment on his students. Afterward, the jonin had produced 3 clones of himself and sent one off with each of his genin to train. Naruto brought himself out of his thoughts as his apartment building came into sight. Most of what the Kakashi clone had him work on were things he'd already known needed improving, but there were some other faults the clone had pointed out that Naruto hadn't known needed work. For that he was grateful. "I'm home," he called out as he walked through the door to his home. Immediately he was greeted with a mouth-watering scent of beef stew and the sight of Haku turning to him from the kitchen section of the apartment. "Welcome home, Naruto-sama." "So that's him?" a voice asked in the Hokage's office as 2 figures watched Naruto and Haku begin their dinner. Hiruzen nodded in affirmation as he stopped channeling chakra into the crystal ball and stowed it in a drawer of his desk. His guest meanwhile moved to sit in the chair across from him. "How is he doing?" the white-haired man asked, crossing his grayish-clothed legs and leaning back in his chair. The Hokage crossed his hands on his desk as he leveled a piercing gaze at the man. "Had you been here more often, you'd know how he's doing, Jiraiya-kun." He struggled to keep his voice as level as he could as a glimmer of rage shone in his eyes. Hiruzen had asked time and time again for Jiraiya to return to the village more often than he did in order for the man to better care for the child, as was his duty. "Don't give me that, sensei," the now named Jiraiya said with a glare. "You know why I couldn't stay in the village any more than I have been. I had my spy network to maintain and Minato's enemies would have worked out who his son was. But you would have still been here." Hiruzen exclaimed, standing from his seat and channeling a large amount of his intent at his only remaining student. He was tired of excuses, be they civilian or ninja alike. It was time everyone began taking responsibility for their actions since the Kyuubi attack. It was always the same excuse with Jiraiya, but no more. Hiruzen was having none of it. The one thing that boy has needed in his life was someone to be there for him. "I did my best to be that person for Naruto, but even then there was only so much I could do, even as Hokage." Hiruzen took a breath to try to calm himself. He'd just regained control of the council, it wouldn't do to suffer a self-induced heart attack. Since you couldn't be bothered to do your duty as his godfather, Naruto-kun has suffered more than any person has a right to. The things the civilians have done to him, he trailed off in a whisper, once again plagued by memories and the guilt of the atrocities Naruto had been through. But Jiraiya tried to get out, but Hiruzen cut him off. "I don't care," he said. "No more excuses. no more running. It is time you did what you promised Minato and Kushina you would do. He sat back in his chair and glared at his student. If you have to dissolve your spy network, so be it. There are other ways to gain information about our enemies without leaving an innocent child in the village to suffer at the hands of fools and bigots who can't tell the difference between the scroll and the kunai sealed within. Jiraiya could only stare in shock at his sensei in response to the man's outburst. But as the moments passed he began to realize the old man was right, he'd been running from his duty as a godfather and as a result, Naruto had suffered at the hands of the civilian populace. Had he not been out traveling the continent for his spy network none of it would have happened. The Toad-san nodded, a spark of determination in his eyes as he looked back up to the third Hokage. "You're right, sensei," he said, "but I'll need some time in order to sort my contacts out. Afterward, I swear, I'll do my duty as I promised all those years ago," he explained. "How long do I have before you'll need me in the village again?" Jiraiya asked. Plans were coming to his head as to how to handle his intelligence network. He meant everything he told the old man, he was going to begin taking his duties as a godfather seriously. Preferably, the second exam. Hiruzen said after a moment of studying his student. He was suspicious of whether he could really trust him on his word now, Jiraiya had made the same promise before. He decided he'd wait and see if Jiraiya actually stuck to his promise this time. If he didn't, well, there was more than one way to bring him back to the village. Jiraiya dipped his head in acceptance of the timeline. "I'll be back before the second exam is over." He moved to the window to leave so he could get a start on what he needed to do. He wasn't going to dissolve the spy network, but perhaps he could train someone to take it over and handle all the traveling required while still reporting back to him within Konoha. "Don't disappoint me," Hiruzen told him as crouched on the seal. Jiraiya didn't respond, but as Hiruzen turned back to his paperwork he smirked. He'd not allow himself to disappoint his sensei again. He'd take Naruto and shape him into a powerful shinobi, so powerful he'd be stronger than the Rikido Sennin himself. The next day, Naruto woke early the next day, being sure to not wake the sleeping Haku next to him. Why she slept next to him had, at first, been a mystery to him as she had started off sleeping on the floor next to his bed. The morning after their arrival in Konoha, Naruto had been woken by the feeling of a warm body next to him and after freaking out for a moment had worked out that the ice user had climbed in with him at some point in the night. Initially he'd put it down to a one-time thing, but it happened again the next night and the night after that. After a while Naruto had just flat out told her to climb in with him when they retired for the night instead of waiting for him to fall asleep. Haku had blushed a crimson color during that talk but had inevitably given in and done as told after seeing Naruto's logic. Nothing had happened between the two teens other than Haku cuddling into her master more and more as the nights went on. Naruto had made sure of that. Admittedly the ice user was attractive in all the right ways, but he wasn't going to start making any advances on her. It was much too soon after her father figure's death and he certainly did not want anything to happen without knowing how she felt about him in return. Besides, he still had to figure out what to do with the girls he already had gunning for his attention before adding any more to the list. Naruto shook himself out of his thoughts and moved to gather his clothes to get dressed for the day. Shortly after he quietly latched the front door to his apartment and took to the rooftops. Haku wouldn't worry herself as he told her his plans for the day during dinner the night before and she'd be waking shortly anyway to get to her training at the hospital. As he traveled, Naruto breathed a deep breath of the cool morning air as excitement began to surge through his veins. He had 2 days before the start of the Chunin exams and he had no intention of letting them go to waste. Lucky for him, he had 2 willing and equally determined training partners to help him in using those days to the fullest. Naruto felt a grin form on his face as he caught sight of the training ground. The next 2 days were going to be fun. Satsuki rose from her bed with a groan of annoyance. She hated it when the waking world ended her dreams, especially those that involved or featured a certain blonde in any way. Right when it was getting to the good stuff too. She thought. A blush colored her face as she remembered Naruto had been hovering over her and that neither of them had been clothed. His weight settling on her had been pleasant, she had been able to smell his scent like never before and something had been pressing against her inner thigh. Satsuki threw the sheets off herself as she felt the heat from her face and leapt to her feet to begin getting dressed and doing anything to distract herself from the dream to avoid being late for her and her friend's training session. The last thing she needed was to leave Hinata alone with Naruto longer than a minute or two. And let Hina-chan get the upper hand and steal Naruto-kun from me. She thought, throwing her clothes on at a rapid pace. Ultimately though, Satsuki knew Hinata wouldn't do anything without her there. The two had agreed a long time ago when they had realized the other had feelings for their mutual friend that they wouldn't do anything unless they were there together to keep the competition even. Still, Satsuki thought, stepping into the hallway of the house she shared with her mother and Sasuke. I shouldn't take too much longer, just to make sure. She quietly made her way through the house and out into the morning. Satsuki took all of a moment to enjoy the peace of the time of day before her form vanished in a burst of speed. Sasuke may be the physically stronger of the two, but Satsuki was by far the faster of the twins. It was something she took much pride in and even more joy in finally being able to show it. She was going to take even more joy in being able to shove it in Sasuke's face during the exams if and when the chance came about. But that thought in mind, the young Uchiha raced through the village to meet her friends. One thing was for sure, they were going to be working hard to ensure they all made it through the exams and advanced their rank. That way they'd truly start to show the village who they really were. Hinata's day didn't start out as pleasantly as either of her two friends had. It rarely ever did, truth be told, but this morning took the cake. After being rudely awoken from her sleep by the impatient knocking of an anxious branch member, she'd been informed that her father and the elders required her presence in the dojo at once. Hinata had bit back the urge to verbally curse, but she'd been expecting this at some point, especially having told her father of her team's coming participation in the Chunin exams. But she hadn't expected it to be so soon. And right when Naruto-kun was about to tear my clothes off and ravish me. She thought to herself, remembering the dream she'd been so rudely taken from. Hinata quickly dressed, foregoing her usual attire of a baggy jacket and instead choosing to go with a tight-fitting chainmail shirt that showed off her already considerable chest. The Hyuga era scowled as she looked at her jacket. In all honesty, she hated the thing. It kept her too warm and she felt too restricted when she trained with her team. The only real quality she liked about it was that it hid her figure from the eyes of those she didn't want ogling her, like her perverted teammate Kiba and generally anyone else who wasn't Naruto. It also served as a way to convince the populace and her clan that she was the shy weakling she wanted them to see her as. Now though, as she made her way to the family dojo, Hinata felt herself smirk in a predatory manner. She was going to enjoy showing them all that they'd been fools. She stopped for a split second outside the dojo in order to gather her thoughts before entering. She didn't bother to knock and wait for permission to enter. Hinata wasn't going to let the old farts think they had any say in her life any longer, so best start here. Hinata walked into the room and stopped in the center. Before her stood Hiashi and the elders of the clan behind him. Beside Hiashi, however, stood Hanabi, Hinata's little sister. "You summoned me?" Hinata asked, her voice calm, collected, and unnervingly uncaring. It annoyed the young girl that she had to put up with her clan's stupidity so early in the morning when she had better things to do than be here. If Hiashi and the elders had been surprised by the change in Hinata, they didn't show it to an outside observer anyway. To Hinata, she saw the twitches in the corners of the elders' mouths and the narrowing of their eyes. She repressed the smirk that wanted to bloom on her face. "Hinata," Hiashi began, his voice cold and callous as per usual when talking to his oldest daughter. "As you and your team are partaking in the upcoming Chunin exams, the elders and myself have decided you should be tested in your abilities. Yourself and Hanabi will spar. Should you fail to make an impression, your title of clan heir will be stripped and given to your sister." "And if I win?" Hinata asked, raising a brow in feigned interest. Truth be told, Hinata knew she could easily leave Hanabi in a bloody heap if she so wished, like what the man before her had done so many times to her. Unlike Hiashi though, Hinata had made a promise to protect her little sister to their mother on the woman's deathbed. That had extended into the mask of shyness Hinata had crafted around herself, only it manifested itself into the inability to lift a finger against the child when Hiashi made them spar. However, as her eyes moved to Hanabi, Hinata saw the smugness in the girl's eyes, the same arrogance and overconfidence that she was going to win. It was the same in the eyes of the elders and Hiashi. They were confident the Hyuga clan would have a new heir that day. Hinata's blood boiled at the sight. "You shall remain the heir of the Hyuga clan," Hiashi replied, his tone tight. Hinata's new attitude was obviously getting to him, but she didn't notice. She was too focused on her sister to be bothered with their father at the moment. "Very well," she said. Her tone was the same as before, but Hinata was making it so. Her sister may have been the most important person in the world to her, besides Naruto, but seeing the younger girl looking down on her just like the rest of the clan. "It's time I taught the brat not to be like father," Hinata thought, resolving to do just that as she settled into her modified stance. The adults in the room quickly vacated the floor and Hanabi took the traditional Jukin stance. Several seconds passed as the two children of Hiashi stared at one another. One in arrogance as she was surely going to win like she always did, and the other in barely repressed anger as she realized she'd been much too soft in her mask when it came to her sister. "Hey Jim," Hiashi barked, bringing his arm down to start the spar. Immediately Hanabi darted forward, her hands striking like snakes and Byakugan blazing furiously. Hinata dodged the first strike and the second before she saw an opening and took it. Her arm moved in a clockwise motion, swooping low onto the coming strike and deflecting it before Hinata's other hand quickly grabbed the arm and pulled the younger girl toward her and stepping in close, taking Hanabi by surprise as she quickly used powerful and precise strikes on the girl's shoulders and wrists to paralyze the muscles and disable her chakra pathways. Finally, and as even more anger began to surge through her, Hinata ducked low and swept a leg behind the stunned girl's legs, knocking her to the ground. To those watching, it was a major surprise that the normally shy and meek daughter of the clan head was suddenly showing such skill and wiping the floor with her younger sister. It was even more of a shock when Hinata placed her foot on the girl's stomach and looked down on her sister with her arms crossed and an angry look on her face. "If I really wanted to, Hanabi, I could send a burst of chakra through my foot and into your heart, stopping it and killing you instantly," Hinata said, glaring down at the girl before looking at her father and the elders off to the side. "I win," she said and made to leave the room, but before she did she stopped and regarded the stunned group. "Don't try this again. I'm not that shy weakling you took me for, and I never was. Amazing what I did when you were looking down on me, huh? Imagine what I could do now if you had actually supported me and not knocked me down at every chance." But that she turned and walked out of the dojo, leaving her sister battered and struggling to regain the use of her arms and the elders as stunned messes. Like she said, she had better places to be. The Ashi could only stare after Hinata, shocked and angry. How is this possible? Chapter 6. The exams begin. Meeting the sand. Fire style. Phoenix flower jutsu. Naruto cursed under his breath and jumped away from the branch he'd been crouching on as a volley of fist-sized fireballs blasted out of the foliage around him and hit the spot he just vacated. Landing on a branch near the last, he turned to look at the flames and saw the fireballs burning out to reveal several shuriken embedded deeply in the bark. Before Naruto could think about the meaning of the shuriken, a large torrent of water surged toward him from a different direction than the fire had. He wasn't quite fast enough to completely miss the water bullet though, and it hit Naruto's side before he could move fully out of the way, sending the Jinchuriki off the branch and through the air and into a nearby tree. As Naruto impacted the hard bark of the tree, two figures appeared on the branches he just vacated. "Did we get him?" Satsuki asked, her eyes staring at Naruto's prone form. Carefully she bent down to retrieve one of her shuriken. "No," Hinata said plainly from the soaked branch. As if to prove her right, the Naruto embedded in the tree before them poofed into a cloud of smoke. "Damn it, I'm really starting to hate those shadow clones," Satsuki raged, punching her palm with her other fist. Meanwhile, Hinata was scanning the area with her Byakugan, inwardly agreeing with her friend as the blonde's clones were identical to him and almost impossible to tell apart from their creator. Suddenly spotting their target, Hinata's eyes widened. "Satsuki, move," she warned, jumping away from the area. Luckily the Uchiha girl listened and jumped as told before a large blast of wind screamed through the surrounding area. "Blind style. Great breakthrough." Naruto breathed out, watching as the trees the girls were previously in bend and twist, almost to the point of breaking, under the force of his jutsu. He could feel their chakra signatures moving toward him through the forested training area and produced a set of shadow clones and sent the two off toward the girls. Each of them splitting up to take a separate target. Sighing, Naruto sat back and closed his eyes and turned his awareness inward toward his chakra. Naruto knew his chakra control was probably the one thing he had to work on the most if he wished to increase his skill levels. Chakra, combined with the hand signs used to control it, made jutsu. Some jutsu took more chakra to work than others did, but if more chakra than was needed was put into the technique, then it went to waste. Sadly, in Naruto's case, a lot of chakra went to waste when he used a jutsu. It was something he was determined to fix, or at the very least reduce the amount he wasted to more acceptable levels. He knew he'd never be able to perform a normal clone, but he had a better technique and the normal clone was rarely used in combat anyway. Suddenly, his mind was flooded with the memories of the clone that went after Hinata and he had to wince. She was not happy. "Are you three really training? Because it looks more like you're trying to kill each other," Sudzurao asked in surprise at the memory. Naruto smirked as Satsuki's clone also dispelled and told him she'd surprised the clone with an exploding log after substituting with it. "Of course we are training, Sudzurao," he replied, standing as he felt Hinata closing in on him. He jumped to the side as a kunai sliced through the air at him, quickly followed by the girl herself, hands raised and poised to strike. Naruto knew better than to try to deflect a Juken strike, as even a glancing blow could leave either his arm paralyzed or his chakra network disabled for a short time. Instead he dodged in a way that would both evade but still leave him in range to go on the offensive as well. The red-streaked blonde launched a flurry of blows at the Hyuga heiress, who used her flexibility to weave in and out of his fists. They kept this up until Hinata jumped back and ran through a series of hand signs. "Water style. Water bullet," she called, spitting a large ball of water out of her mouth at Naruto. "But it's better to train like your life depends on it than not. That way it is more like the situations we can run into on a mission." Sudzurao nodded to his host, seeing the logic behind his statement, but that didn't stop the sweat drop currently running down the back of his head. Naruto barely managed to dodge by leaping over the water bullet. He landed and went through his own hand signs, much faster than Hinata had. "Wine style. Great breakthrough." The air around him seemed to come alive as streams of the stuff rushed forward out of nowhere, collecting into a variable wall of wind that sped at Hinata, much too fast for her to dodge, and it sent her flying in the opposite direction. She grunted as she collided with a tree, but Naruto smirked when she disappeared in a billow of smoke and was replaced with a log. Praise the log. He unconsciously thought. The log was the nearest thing to a holy relic for most of the shinobi of Konoha. It had saved hundreds of their lives, repeatedly, over the years. As such, the ninja of the leaf had a fondness for it, bordering on holy worship. Clang. The sound of metal on metal rang out as Naruto quickly raised a kunai and deflected the flock of shuriken flying at him as Satsuki appeared, running at full speed at him. Her two Tomo Sharingan spinning wildly in her eyes. Crap, if Satsuki was using her Dojutsu, it meant she was tired of the hit and run tactics. It's been a while since we've gone all out with each other, Naruto thought. Training with Hinata and Satsuki was always brutal, even in the past when they'd first started it had been as they put themselves and each other through the grinder each and every time. Being determined to prove everyone in the village wrong did that to someone. Now though, Naruto was on a different team than his friends. Getting together to train like this was much more difficult than it had been. Even then, the time they managed to get together to train didn't prove as fulfilling as it used to, since they couldn't go all out. Today was a rare opportunity and they were taking full advantage of it. Despite all that though, Naruto was having fun. More fun than he'd had in a long while. Judging by the looks on their faces, the girls were as well. Naruto mentally shrugged, coming to a decision as Hinata appeared running at him from behind. Within the seal, Sudzurao's head perked up when he felt Naruto channel his chakra to his eyes. So far, the only time his host had used the Rasengan since coming back to the village had been to threaten that mob of civilians, and when Hinata and Satsuki had asked to see it. Neither time had been for use in training or a fight. This should be interesting. The former Kitsune thought, setting back on his hunches in order to pay better attention to the outside world. The fact that Naruto was using the Rasengan against the Byakugan and Sharingan at the same time was icing on the cake, as his Dojutsu had aspects of both. Naruto's eyes morphed to their golden state as his vision sharpened, and the world seemed to expand and become more colorful. He jumped, dodging the girls as they reached him at the same time, and quickly used a substitution to replace himself with one of Satsuki's full-in shuriken. Said shuriken happened to be lying just to the side of where he'd previously been and where Hinata and Satsuki currently were. Satsuki tried to jump away as she saw the substitution, but quickly found herself unable to move, courtesy of the thin line of wire now wrapped around both her and Hinata. All the trying to jump managed to do was put the two off balance to the point where they quickly fell. Hinata on the ground and Satsuki on top of her. Damn it. Satsuki bit out as her body was smashed into her friend's. Naruto almost fell over laughing as he watched the two heiresses pressed against each other and struggling to break apart. However, a small part of himself couldn't help but appreciate the sight, as well as the two were early bloomers, and their assets smashing together was a vision he'd only ever dared to imagine in his wildest dreams. Okay, you win. Hinata growled at her male friend, seeing him struggling to control his chuckles. Before she or Satsuki could say anything else though, a shrill beep blared out from the alarm clock on a tree stump nearby. Naruto's sweat dropped, realizing they'd lost track of time again. Sudzurao sighed to himself, knowing the fight was over, and lamenting the letdown of not seeing a true fight between the three ocular bloodlines. A half-hour walk later, the trio found themselves traveling through the business district of Konoha. A small argument currently in progress with the three. Ramen. Naruto growled, pointing one way down the street as he glared at Satsuki. Bark. Satsuki bit back, pointing the other way, her glare just as strong. Between the two stood Hinata, an expression of exasperation on her face and a sweat drop currently working its way down the back of her head. Me and my big mouth. She thought, regretting asking the two where they wanted to go for lunch. She should have known the question was taboo when the two were together, given each time she'd asked before the current situation was usually the result. However, before Hinata's thoughts or the argument between her friends could progress any further, a shout rang out from around a corner a short distance away from them. Let go of him, you bully. Naruto's eyes narrowed, that voice sounded familiar. The trio hardly spared each other a glance as they took off, readying themselves for a fight. Rounding the corner, Naruto's eyes narrowed further into a glare. Before him, Konohamaru, the third's grandson, was being held in the air by his oversized scarf by a person dressed in an all-black bodysuit and purple markings on his face with a large person-shaped object wrapped in bandages on his back. Standing slightly behind and to the side of them was a blonde girl with her hair separated into 4 pigtails and dressed in a lavender fishnet dress combo with a red sash-like belt holding it together. She looked at the scene with an air of annoyance about her. "Come on, Kankuro," she said, turning to leave. "Let the kid go, we have to meet up with Baki-sensei." The now-named Kankuro didn't move, instead he glared harder at the child in his grip. "I don't care, Tamari," he growled without looking back at the girl. "The brat ran into me. I think he needs to learn to watch where he's going." He raised his free arm, going to strike Konohamaru, but was stopped when he felt the cold metal of a kunai pressed against his neck. You know. A cold voice said to his left, almost growling. A foreign shinobi attacking the grandson of our Hokage is grounds enough to start a war. A cold feeling began to bloom in Kankuro's stomach as Naruto increased the pressure of the kunai against the sand nin's neck. Naruto smirked as he felt the boy stiffen as Hinata appeared in a blur of speed and lightly tapped the makeup-wearing boy's wrist, causing him to gasp when his hand opened involuntarily. Konohamaru hit the ground with a thud and hurried to get up and hide behind his rescuers. Hey. Tamari moved to grab the object strapped to her back but stopped when she spotted the glare being leveled at her by a pair of red Sharingan eyes. I wouldn't, Satsuki muttered, spinning a shuriken on her finger. Unless you want a broken arm. She said, the tomos in her eyes spinning in warning. And if you're not fast enough? Tamari asked, her voice was more confident than she felt. She and Kankuro were outnumbered after all. Then you'll have to deal with your moody friend in the tree over there. Naruto retorted, returning his kunai to his hip pouch and glaring up at a nearby tree. Following his gaze, the sand shinobi instantly froze at seeing the red-head teen standing on a branch overlooking the group. Jigara. Kankuro stuttered, stepping back from the former blonde and nearly tripping over his own feet. Gaara's black-ringed and pupilless green eyes seemed to glare down at the older boy, silencing him without speaking a word. Kankuro. He spoke in a bored voice. Your actions are a disgrace to our village. He disappeared in a swirl of sand and reappeared between Kankuro and Tamari. Sorry, Gaara Kankuro began, but a blast of killing intent from the Ritiid silenced him. Shut up, or I'll kill you. Gaara said, glaring at the puppet user. I apologize for my brother's actions against your friend. Gaara spoke again, this time to Naruto. As his eyes met with the crimson-haired teen's own, Naruto felt Sudzurao stir within the seal. Shukaku the dragon muttered. Something wrong, Sudzurao? The former blonde asked his tenant. Be careful around this one, hatchling. Was the reply. I feel the presence of the one-tails within him. Despite his appearance, this kid will be dangerous if you have to fight in the exams. I expect the gourd on his back holds the sand Shukaku gives him control over. Noted. Naruto thought back, taking in Gaara's appearance. Especially the red kanji symbolizing love tattooed on his head. In the time since the Land of Waves, Naruto had asked Sudzurao about the other tailed beasts and the abilities granted to their hosts in the event that he ever came across another Jinchuriki. What's with the rings around his eyes? He mentally asked his tenant. There was a pause before Sudzurao answered. One of the pitfalls of being host to Shukaku is he's insane. He constantly whispers to his hosts, doing everything he can to drive them mad, as a result his hosts rarely ever sleep. The dragon said. Anytime they do give Shukaku the chance to take control of their body. The insomnia only serves to further drive his Jinchuriki mad. Naruto could only nod in return to the information, imagining what Gaara had to endure from the one-tails. He was thankful at least that Sudzurao wasn't insane like his sibling or intent to escape his seal by forcing himself out every time Naruto slept. I am Gaara of the desert. What are your names? Gaara asked, interrupting Naruto's thoughts and eyeing the group as his siblings stood quietly behind him. Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto introduced himself and then pointed to both Hinata and Satsuki in turn. And these are my friends Hinata Hyuga and Satsuki Uchiha. I see. Gaara said and turned to begin leaving. I look forward to seeing you three in the exams. He began walking. Kankuro and Tamari followed. Neither having said a word since their brother unleashed his killing intent. Before the three could fully leave, however, Naruto called out to them. I look forward to seeing you in the exams too, number 1. Number 9 says hi. With that said, Naruto turned and led his group away. He never saw Gaara pause in his steps or the bloodthirsty grin that took root on his face as the one-tails began screaming for blood in his mind. Naruto shook his head in disgust as he and his teammates walked through the halls of the academy. The raven-haired Uchiha next to him looked significantly beat up. Somehow the Uchiha had managed to get himself into a spar with Rock Lee of all people, the Taijutsu expert of Team 10, according to Hinata when they talked about potential opponents yesterday. Why Sasuke had felt the need to call out the Genjutsu being used to confuse other candidates and thus bring attention to the three of them, Naruto would never know. Obviously the fight, if it could be called a fight, had not gone the way he knew Sasuke had thought it would. Instead of an easy win, Lee had been soundly beating the Uchiha up until he had tried to launch the finishing move. Literally out of nowhere, a giant talking turtle had plowed into Lee and began berating him for whatever reason. Then Team 10 sensei showed up. Naruto shivered. Might Guy was a sight to be weary of. Not only was a bigger copy of Lee, but the feeling of pure physical strength he'd gotten off the man had been intense. It was similar to what he felt from Kakashi and many other jonin he'd met at this point, but Naruto had a feeling that if it came to a straight-up Taijutsu fight, Guy would win. Speaking of which, Naruto looked up when he heard Sakura's surprised voice. Kakashi-sensei? What are you doing here? Standing just outside the door that would hold the first part of the Chunin exams was the gray-haired sensei of Team 7, his book in hand and his ever-present carefree demeanor as he glanced up at his students. "I'm here to congratulate you guys on making it past the first trial," he said with a wave. "Had you been fooled by the Jinjutsu set up by Izumo and Katetsu, I'd have been thoroughly disappointed in my team," he said, trailing his uncovered eye over the three genin. "That was Sasuke-kun." Sakura gushed. He called those two out as soon as he figured it out. Naruto could only shake his head at the pinket. Telling everyone it was there wasn't the point of it. He thought, noticing Kakashi's eye roll as Sakura continued to gush over her crush. Clearly his thoughts matched that of his student. "Yes, well," Kakashi said, breaking the girl out of her spiral and refocusing his team. "From here on out things get real. Other teams will not hesitate to kill if need be," he said. "I expect the same from the three of you." Naruto and Sasuke nodded to their sensei, while Sakura seemed unsure but nodded as well after a moment. "Very good," Kakashi continued. "Try not to die. Later." He waved and disappeared in a swirl of leaves. Naruto grinned and took Kakashi's departure as a sign to continue into the exam room. Finally, he thought. Time to let loose. His chest swelling in confidence, Naruto grasped the handles of the doors and swung them open. What if Naruto has ancient chakra bloodline? Thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoy this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel and leave a like if you guys need the next part, comment down, and thanks for watching the video and see you guys in the next video.